Let's integrate Python with Clerk for user management. But before we do, let's talk about why. First off, let's say you wrote a program in Python and you want other people to use it. Better yet, you want customers to use it. You want people to actually pay to use your code. Now, how do you actually go about doing this? Well, you're going to need a web framework that will allow you to take your Python code and just run it on the internet. There's a lot of them out there. You could use FastAPI, you could use Django, you could use Flask, you could use Reflex, which is FastAPI in the backend. That's what's under the hood. But the idea here is you need to select one of the web frameworks. So which one to select? Well, when you use user authentication through Clerk, you actually can select any of them and you can actually switch between them fairly easily. Now, what it comes down to though is storing your data somewhere for your users, such as on a Postgres database, which we'll take a look at in a little bit. But the next thing would be, which web framework are you most comfortable with? I'm going to show you how to integrate Clerk with Django to start. I think it's an amazing way to add a bunch of features that Django just doesn't really have out of the box or doesn't make it that easy to do. This has everything to do with social authentication. So really, when it comes down to users, Django, in my opinion, has historically been one of the best web frameworks for managing users and handling users, but it starts to fall apart when we want to use a different front end. Let's say, for instance, you want a React.js front end instead of Django templates. Now, if you don't even know what I'm talking about with those two things, well, then you'll probably want a React.js front end, and you'll probably specifically want a Next.js front end, or maybe even a Nuxt.js front end. But the Next.js front end is super nice because you can use something like v0.dev, and this can actually just generate the front end for you. And you might have to know a few things about how to use it. I'll show you some of those. But the idea here is our front end is probably going to rapidly change, where our back end could also rapidly change using Clerk and using it correctly. But that's not the only reason. The thing is, when it comes down to Django, if you want to add in something like Google login or Facebook login or GitHub login or all of those things or Slack login, you could totally do that with Django, and you might be able to do it using just Django AllAuth. But as soon as you want to bring in a new front end like React or Next or Nuxt or iOS or Android, as soon as you want that front end that's different, then AllAuth gets really challenging really quickly for social accounts, for those third-party social accounts. So AllAuth is great. I really, really like this tool. But when you want to manage that third-party interaction, it really starts to get challenging inside of just AllAuth when you also need those front ends, which I think is a huge part of all this. Well, yes, I did partner with Clerk on this series, but to me, this might change everything that I'm doing. And I'm not actually just saying that. Using Clerk and being able to quickly pass around user keys and access and online and connect our users, I can actually do that on all of these different frameworks. In other words, if I have a Next.js front end, I can actually call FastAPI and Django and Reflex and Flask. I can have all of those be called with the same front end and have access to the same users. And of course, if I'm using Postgres as my database, I can also use all of those other tools to also access that same data. There's a lot of really good things about this that we can really unlock when we just remove our users from being a fixture in these web frameworks. Now, in the long run, I can't say for sure if Clerk is going to be the only thing I end up using for user auth, but after playing around with it, I'm shocked at how good it is and how easy it is to spin things up really, really quickly. Let's take a look at how to do that right now. Let's do a quick demo of what it is that we're going to be building. Now, obviously, this is Next.js. This is a React project. This is a Django project. This is a FastAPI project. We're going to see how all of these things can be integrated using just Clerk and Clerk authentication. So let me just show you a little bit as to what we'll do. First off, you'll be able to log into your user. You can customize this. We do. That's why it kind of looks kind of funny. Then we can log in with something like Google, and then there I am. I'm logged in. Now I can also jump into the Clerk dashboard, go into my users, and delete any users I just simply don't want anymore. Boom, that user is now deleted. I go back into this project, session over, can't do anything. So I need to log in and refresh and do all of that stuff. I also have routes that require a login. So if I go to the dashboard here, I could then go and log in or create a brand new user account, in which case it will then bring me right back to Clerk, finish that whole thing off, and I'm back into that dashboard. It persists all of that data. Here I can actually store some data in here as well. I can send this data, and you might be wondering, where is it that I'm sending this data? Well, I can send it to Django, I can send it to FastAPI, I can send it to both. The idea, of course, in our case is we're using Django. Django and a custom user. Here is that custom user, and then here are the models for that custom user. And we also even create our own decorator and helper functions in here. We get this user ID from the request itself. We update or create a user directly from Clerk as well. This is that custom user. All of this stuff is great. It's something that Django does really well. But then our API views are, well, this one looks a little bit complicated, but it's all done in Django, and it's not really that complicated. We load in some data, we create that data, we respond that data, or we list out the data itself, in which case it's all narrowed down to a specific user. And of course, it is a request.user. That request user is the Clerk user that's in here. It is fantastic and really easy to get all implemented, especially if you've done a lot of these things before. If you haven't, I'm going to take you step by step so you see all of it done. And we'll start with React so you can call your different backends in here. And then we will also build out different backends as well. A lot of this is going to be done through Docker Compose, which makes it easier to bring all this up, but can also make it a little bit tricky from time to time. So of course, bear with me on those things. I think it's well worth it. Now, the other thing about Clerk that you might really like is you can come in here and you can configure different things about this. You can require a phone number to have a user log into their account, or an email address, which of course is what we're doing. You can also have a username. You can have passkeys. You can have email verification. There's all sorts of things that you can do for that. And it's just a matter of activating it, and then it's pretty much ready to go. You can also add in other single sign-ons. So if you wanted to add in very specific ones, let's say, for instance, you're going to come in here and you're going to grab, let's do GitHub. You can enable for sign in and sign up, or you can enable it to activate it later. You can go ahead and add this connection in. As soon as you do something like that, then you can, let's go ahead and log out of our user here. I'll log in again. And what we would end up seeing here is once I refresh the page, there is GitHub, and I can then log in to my account with that GitHub account as well. This doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be the exact same user, but it is allowing for me to log into that account altogether. And it is the same user because of how the email is set up. And if I go to manage my account, look at those connected accounts. They are connected without me doing any extra work. I can't even believe how simple a lot of this stuff is. It is super nice. So you can add in all sorts of providers in here and all that. So that's a key part of all of this. We're going to be building it all out to make sure that you can do it as well. Now, all of the code is going to be on GitHub as well under usernado Clerk times Python. Now, the reason this is adding users to Python is because Python is going to be the thing that's in the back end powering a lot of stuff. Of course, we could just use React.js to do the login. We could just use Next.js to do the login. The reason we have a front end altogether is because you need one for the user to be able to log in. So it kind of makes sense that that's going to be the first thing that you see as well right now. But so much of this is about integrating it as simply as possible within the code. So if we look at FastAPI, for example, here's the things that we need to do for FastAPI to get our user ID from any request. It's really just that simple. Then, of course, we can post out that data and we can send data to the backend there as well. It's actually very straightforward. Now, if you're not aware of this, what this does is it allows me to have a Django project and a FastAPI project running side by side, and pretty much any other sort of Python project that can accept requests in there and parse out the user data from that. We can then have a bunch of different API endpoints that are small, tiny little things that we can just associate our Clerk user ID to, store the data, and now it's associated to that user. It is crazy how good that is and how simple it is as well. So I highly encourage you to go through this one. Let's get started right now. We're going to start off with a proof of concept to log users in and register them, to manage our users. We're going to do it all inside of React.js with Vite. Now, React.js itself is a minimal JavaScript library. You don't have to write that much code to get a lot out of it. Now, you can also use other tools that are very similar to React, like Preact, and it'll probably work just fine. But the point here is we want to make sure that it does work, in which case we'll use React directly with Vite. We'll see what that does in just a moment. Then, of course, we're going to go ahead and integrate Clerk to log in users, and this won't take very long, as you'll see. Now, the way I'm going to set up my environment is by using Docker and specifically Docker Compose. Now, for those of you who have never used this before, I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible to jump in. Docker can be really complex or really simple. I'm going to go the as simple way as possible, hopefully for those of you who've never done it. And of course, if you are a little bit more advanced, feel free to use Node.js directly. Of course, that would mean you would download and install it. Now, if you're going to follow with me on Docker, go ahead and download Docker Desktop right now at docker.com. Once you have that downloaded, you're going to open up your terminal window and you're going to go ahead and do Docker Compose just to make sure that that part is working. If that's working, if you see these commands versus something like Docker whatever or whatever, you don't want to see these errors here. You want to see a bunch of different options because of Docker Compose. If this is the case, you are now ready to start building out our project. Trust me, it's going to be very straightforward. Let's go ahead and see. Let's set up our Docker Compose environment so we can set up our React project. Now, I'm going to be using Cursor here, but you can use VS Code, Windsurf, any of them. I'm not going to be using the AI features at all. Feel free to use those as you see fit as well. The idea here, of course, is we're going to go ahead and open up a new folder. So go ahead and open folder here, navigate to where you want to store this project. In my case, I'm going to put it in my dev folder, create a new folder called user NATO, and we'll go ahead and open this up. So I'm going to try to have all of the code across this entire course inside of just user NATO. Normally, I would separate the front end and back end, but I want to make it as simple as possible for us going forward. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create something called compose.yaml. You can do YAML, you can do YML, you can do docker-compose.yaml. The modern version is just compose.yaml, and I like doing YAML with an A in there. I don't think it's that big of a deal. So the idea here is we need to declare what it is that we're trying to build out for our environment. So the very first one, I'm going to go ahead and say services. I'm going to call this simply my React app itself, and then we need to declare an image that we're going to use. Now, I did mention before we're going to be using Node.js, but using Docker itself, we don't actually have to install Node.js. We can go to hub.docker.com and we can do a quick search for Node.js. We can select the official image and hit enter, and this will actually give us only 2 images here, which gives us the Node.js image. These are quite literally the same thing, except now we can specify exactly what version we want to use, and we can bring it up, bring it down without installing extra stuff on our machine. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and use the LTS. This is the long-term support, and I'm going to be using the Bullseye version, which is meant to be a little bit smaller than some of the other ones. Actually, we could even look for the Slim version. I think that will even work as well, which is even smaller in terms of an image itself. So for those of you who have never done this before, you're going to be like, what is going on here? Well, the idea is we want to specify what runtime we want our app to work on. In our case, we want it to work on the Node.js runtime, and then we want to use the LTS version that is Slim. So what I did here was I declared the Node.js image and then the long-term support of Slim. So hopefully this is straightforward. If it's not, please let me know in the comments. But the idea here is we want to go ahead and use that, and then we're going to do a command called sh-c, and I'm just going to go ahead and echo out hello world. And we'll put a trailing slash there. Okay, so let's see if I can just work based off of only these 2 parameters here. I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal here. I'm going to list things out, make sure I'm in the right location. I'm going to go ahead and do Docker Compose. Then I'm going to write run, and then the name of this app right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and do /bin/bash, or you can even do /sh. but this will allow me to run at the terminal inside of this container image. I'll go ahead and hit enter. As soon as I run that, we can see that I'm here. Now, yours might take longer to actually load. It might actually pull the image down to make sure that it's working. But in here, I'm now using the actual container image. This is a Linux machine, even though I'm working on my Mac. If you're on your Windows or Linux, it's a subdivision of that. It's a container image that's now running. And we just declared the minimal amount to make sure that that's in there. So from here on out, what we can do is we can start building out this project. Now, one of the other commands you're going to want to use is docker compose and then down, and then even -- remove -orphans. This is one of the things that you're going to want to use a lot. This will bring down that image and basically delete everything that's inside of it. That's how Docker containers work. So in order for us to not delete everything, what we can do in here is we can specify a folder called React app or something along those lines, where we can then use this folder as a key part of our project. Now, before I get there though, I'm going to go ahead and actually come back into my definition, and I'm going to go ahead and do volumes. And then I'm going to go ahead and say / goes to /app. And then we're going to go ahead and do our working dir to /app. Now, this might not be that clear as to what's going on, but if you remember, if we look back into our terminal here, as soon as I opened this up, I was in the root of the system, the Linux system itself. Now I just made a little bit of a change here. I changed it to volumes and working dir. So if I run it again, the exact same configuration, notice it now changes the directory that I'm in. And if I list things out, I can also now see compose.yaml. Prior to this, we did not have that app directory at all. Now that we do, I can do the next step, which is running those npm commands. So if I do npm here, I should see this exactly. Now, the reason npm does work in here has everything to do with the fact that we're using the node image at the baseline level. Node.js is already available in here. We can see that with, I think, node -- version. We can see the actual version of Node.js that's in here as well, which of course we could verify by going to nodejs.org and seeing that's the latest version that's out and available. Super cool. So that makes things a little bit easier on us in terms of setting up Node itself without dealing with it on your local machine. Now, on my local machine, I'm actually not sure what version I have. So I'm going to go ahead and do node -- version, hit enter. This is not quite the newest version. As we see down here, I'm missing a few subversions. It probably wouldn't make that much of a difference, but in this case, it absolutely could make a difference. It just probably wouldn't because of the third-party packages we're going to go ahead and use. So the next big question then is, what do we need to do here? How do we actually set up our React.js application? At this point, we now have Node.js pretty much ready to go. So all we need to do is move to the next one where we actually can use npm to set up our React app through Vite. Let's take a look. We're now going to set up our React.js application through Vite and through the lens of Docker Compose, but still using Node.js and npm. So the idea here, of course, is I'm going to open up my terminal here. Notice that my Docker Compose stuff is not going right now. So all I want to do is run Docker Compose run, and then the app name itself. And then I'm going to go ahead and do bin/bash at the very end. What if I actually didn't do bin/bash here? If I hit enter, this actually would just run this command right here, which is exactly what's happening. If I were to comment this out with a hashtag in front of it and run that, it then jumps into Node.js, which is also super nice if you need to run any of those things. Now, you can also run Node.js by calling it directly. So if I were to do run app and then node, or probably something more like bin/node, that will allow me to open that up. Looks like maybe not. Let's try just simply node and see if that does it. Sure enough, it does. Okay. So the point of that was mostly so that we can actually get back into Docker Compose, the actual bin itself. So if I do Docker Compose run bin/bash, hit enter, it will allow me to go in. I do see this warning here that it found orphan containers, so we need to remove those things. The way you do that is pretty simple. We can kill that terminal again. You just go ahead and do Docker Compose down, and then -- remove -orphans, just like that. That will take all of the old containers that you're no longer using anymore, down and just remove them from your system or having them available, and that warning will go away. Every once in a while, it does take a little time to run that, but you might want to run it from time to time. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and do our Docker Compose run, the name of our service here, which is React_app, then bin/bash. Now we're on a terminal. Now we can go ahead and use npm. We can run npm install npm and do global, so updating npm inside of the container itself. Now, this might actually not do a whole lot, but if you were running npm on your local machine, you would probably want to do that, as in on your outside of Docker local machine. So the idea here is we now have npm in there. So what I want to do is I want to create my app here. Now the point of this though is I'm inside of the same exact directory as compose.yaml. In this case, I actually mounted my local directory inside of my actual containerized application. We're going to change this a little bit in just a moment, but the idea here is we're going to run npm create Vite, V-I-T-E. I know if you speak English, that is Vite to you, but it's pronounced Vite. Anyways, so we're going to go ahead and do create Vite at latest, and then we're going to call this what we want to call it. In my case, I'm going to call it React Clerk. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and it's going to ask me if I want to install this package. I'll go ahead and say yes, and then it's going to ask me what framework I want to use. You see all of the things Vite can do. We're going to be using React. So go ahead and select that. We're also going to use SWC. I believe it's a much faster compiler. You can use either version of JavaScript, or if you know TypeScript, go ahead and do that. I prefer JavaScript, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with JavaScript right here. And then there we go. So now it actually created the scaffolding of the project. It didn't do anything else. This is what Vite does really well. It will create the baseline code that you'll need for a React application. So app.jsx, this is all React stuff. Fantastic, super easy to get going. So most of the time, this is what you'll end up creating, and then what you would end up doing is you would navigate into that folder. But before I navigate into that folder, I'm going to exit out of the actual container itself. I'm going to go ahead and call Docker Compose down. Now what I want to do is I want to update compose.yaml a little bit. I don't want this entire folder in here. I just want their React Clerk folder to being my app inside of the container. The way we do that is we specify the React Clerk folder itself. So what we've got here is we're grabbing what folder we want to mount into our actual container itself. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And now once again, I'll run that same command, hit enter. This time when I run ls, I will see all of that code in there instead of just compose.yaml. In fact, I won't see compose.yaml at all, which is exactly why I'm doing it this way. It isolates the rest of my entire folder here from other projects. At some point, we will have other projects. So that's kind of the point. So now that we've got that, we're still inside of our compose.yaml here. I'm going to go ahead and type out clear to just clear the terminal a little bit. Then I'm going to go ahead and run npm install, hit enter. This will install all of the packages that are in package.json. These are really just Vite stuff. So if we scroll down to dependencies, we see React is in here. It's version 19. We see all the dev dependencies that are in here as well, which of course has Vite in there. But now we've got React going. It's saying there's an update to npm that we can run. This is a much different update, so let's go ahead and run it, and we would actually end up seeing that major version being installed as well. So really the last step here would be to run our application like it told us a while ago. The way we run it is npm run dev. Of course, if you didn't know that, you would just go into package.json and you would see all of these different scripts in here. These are the commands that you can run. So run dev, hit enter. It's going to go ahead and have this local host here. If I do command click and try to open it on my local machine, I'll probably see this. Now, this is 100% correlated to how Docker works. And a big reason I'm showing you this and didn't set up the configuration already is so that you're aware that Docker does isolate services unless you specify to no longer isolate them. So when we specified this volume, we were very specific about using what code we want our Docker container to be able to use. What code is in there? What code are we mounting in there, which is this volume. Think of it kind of like a hard drive. If you were mounting that into your computer, that hard drive would be available to that computer. We're doing that same thing here with this folder. We're just mounting this folder into this container that is quite literally isolated from our project, from our machine itself. So how do we unisolate it? Well, there's two things that play right here. The first thing is our local machine has a port that it's trying to access at 5173. At the same time, our container is, in theory, trying to expose the port at 5173. So inside of Docker Compose, we need to let Docker know that that's happening, that we want our local machine to be able to have access at a specific port to a specific port. And of course, these ports are the same in this case. So if we come in here and define port, which is going to be our host port to our container port, that's going to be 5173. And that, of course, is going to be for this version, the actual web browser, whereas the container itself is also exposed at the exact same port. It's really important that you understand that we're mapping the same port to the same port on the container itself. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and actually take down our Docker Compose. We'll go ahead and run Docker Compose down of remove orphans because we want to rerun this command with those those ports exposed when we go ahead and run our Docker Compose up. I'm going to go back into bin/bash here, and we're just going to go ahead and do npm run dev, hit enter. One of the things you see immediately is it says use host to expose. I didn't actually run that. So let's see if with these ports, I can actually access it. If I refresh in here, I can't access it. So this could lead to a lot of frustration that you may have using something like Docker, where you might abandon it altogether and just go ahead and try to run your React project directly inside of your local machine. And I don't blame you for something like that because this can be fairly frustrating. So I'm going to show you what we would do to fix this problem. First off, we're going to go ahead and take this down. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to run your React project locally. You need to delete these node modules. These node modules are very container specific. They are not related to your local machine. So you'd have to remove those, and then you'd have to go into React and Clerk, and you would go remove-rf node modules, or just go ahead and come up here and delete that folder, either one. And then you would run npm install all over again, which would then install them on your local machine. But now that I did that, I obviously need to redo it in my container because we will fix the container issue. But let's go ahead and do that now by actually running up Docker Compose run React app. There we are. Now again, I need to run npm install just to make sure that those node modules are in there. When we mount this volume, just like whenever you're using an external volume, it's actually a two-way street. So mounting it means that I can make those changes. That's why we're seeing these files in there. Hopefully that was kind of clear by what happened, but I just want to make sure it's extra clear now. Okay, so now that we've got it back to being installed, I can once again run npm run dev, but I can also do -- or im-, then -- host. Hit enter, and that should allow for this to work on my local machine. So now it's actually in a hosting mode, so that then I should be able to refresh on my Chrome browser and actually be able to see it potentially. So it's actually still not working, so I want to save this, and I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I think part of the reason it's not working has to do with the fact of how we're actually calling it. So I'm going to go ahead and do Docker Compose and down, and then I'm going to go ahead and use the remove orphans again, and make sure I spell it correctly. And here we go. Okay, so this should actually take it down in just a moment. And now we're ready for the correct command. So at this point, we've been running Docker Compose run. What I want to do now is Docker Compose up. You can also specify up for the specific app, or if you just run Docker Compose up, it's going to run all of your apps at the same time. So we'll specify the app for now as our React app. We'll hit enter. And so we've got a little bit of an error in here. That's because of our actual command here. This is the incorrect command now. So once again, we want to do npm run dev, the im-, and then -- again, or another im-, and host. Save that file. Now go ahead and run up. Now it's running inside of the Docker Compose up, which should expose the application, and now we have access to it. So again, those many different steps that we'd have to do just to get this thing running can absolutely be frustrating. But I promise you, using Docker across a bunch of different technologies is going to save you so much headache in the long run, even if it's a little bit tricky right now. When we go into using something like Django, we're going to see a little bit more of an advanced backend than what we've got here. But now that we have it running, it's time to actually integrate Clerk. Let's sign up for the free plan on Clerk. Go to this link right here. It gives me credit, basically tells Clerk, hey, we like what Justin's doing. Let's keep doing more. The idea here though is after you get to Clerk, you're gonna want to sign in or just hit start building. The free plan is generous, so we won't really have to worry about that for some time. I'm gonna be using Google in my account. And then if it prompts you to create an application like this, just call it what you'd like. In my case, I'm gonna call it user NATO. Right now, you can decide what sign-in options you want to support. I'm just going to do Google to make it simple, but in the development environment, you can use all of these. You can use as many as you like, and there's probably even more that are coming, as well as even custom ones, which I haven't tinkered with yet, but I sure will, and especially if you want to see it. But the idea here is I'm going to create my application just like that. Now, it's pretty simple to set up. And of course, they give you amazing docs to do it. Right now, I'm just going to go off of the React one that's right here. It's a few steps that we need to go through. And in our case, we will need to go through these steps inside of the container on how it works. We'll have to solve that problem really soon, which will allude to the fact of these node modules. The way it's being working on through the container, we may or may not want to keep it as is. So first and foremost though, I'm going to go ahead and do Docker Compose, and we'll go ahead and do run for the React app again, and we're going to go into bin/bash. We'll go ahead and hit enter, and we'll take a look at what we need to do with the docs itself. It's really straightforward. We already have our Vite app in here. Hey, what do you know? Next up, all we need to do is install Clerk itself. So we'll go ahead and run that. It's a straightforward installation process, and it will update our package.json. Notice that it's asking me to update npm again. It keeps asking me that. I'll explain that later, but it has everything to do with our container image that we're just using the standard one, but we'll solve that later. Next up, what we want to do is bring in our .env. Now, this is actually something that's super cool about using the Docker Compose stuff. So inside of Docker Compose here, I can come into React Clerk, or down here, I can do a .env file, paste that in, and just save it as is. So what this means then is inside of Docker Compose, I can actually come in here and declare an env file and do .env. This .env file is going to be injected into this container. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and do Docker Compose, and we'll do down, and then I'll remove, orphans as we've seen many times. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring it back up in just a moment. So of course, what it will do is exit out of this Clerk installation that we just did in just a moment. There it is. Now I'm going to go ahead and run that again. What I should be able to do, assuming I saved the compose.yaml file, I should be able to do echo $, and then the variable itself, hit enter, and I should be able to see this. This is one of the things that I really like about using Docker Compose in my local environment during development is I can inject environment variables like this and keep it separate from all of my projects without any sort of third-party dependencies to load in those environment variables. I can just use the native version of it, which is definitely something you can do. And so now what we see here is importing that key. We want to import it in our code. This is using main.tsx, which you can or can't do. I mean, it's up to you. I am not using TSX, I'm using JSX. TSX is TypeScript, JSX is JavaScript. So inside of main.jsx, we have basically the same stuff going on here. It's just written out slightly different. So all I'm going to do here is grab the publish key in here, and all I want to see is I want to log that. I'm going to go ahead and run console log of that publish key. Let's see if that ends up working for us. So of course, a publish key is going to be something that can be exposed to the outside world. It's not a secret key that you might use otherwise. So I'll keep Docker running. This is another nice thing about Docker is I can open another one and do Docker compose up and just hit enter. This will also run the application. I don't actually have to take down every single one every single time. So with that, I should be able to go into my front end, refresh in there, go and inspect the element, go into the console, and there is that same exact key showing up because of that console log. So we're in a good spot in terms of setup. Next, of course, is going back into Clerk's dashboard here. And then we see that if I scroll on down inside of main.txx, I can actually bring in the Clerk provider. So we will see this again for sure, especially when we go into the Next.js stuff, we will see this Clerk provider. So this is one of a few places as to where you could put this. You could put it in main.jsx. You could also put it in app.jsx. The idea though is the provider needs to go around the app itself, which is why it's often recommended you put it in main.jsx at this point. So this provider is going to give us a bunch of stuff that we'll see in just a moment. The key part is we need to add in our publish key, and then after sign out URL, you can do some configuration in there for those two things. So we'll come in here just like that. So the injected publish key and then some other arguments that you might want to add. For now, that's just fine. So we'll go ahead and save that. Then the next part is going to be our app.jsx. So I'm going to scroll on down to app.tx here. So what we've got is a bunch of things related to Clerk. So I could do it directly in the app itself, or I'm going to just go ahead and create something like navbar.jsx. I'm just trying to keep it as simple as possible here. I'm going to go ahead and copy the version they have. This says TSX, but it doesn't have anything that's TypeScript specific, which would have some errors in there if it did. I'm just going to rename this to simply navbar. It looks a lot like a navbar, so I'm going to go ahead and just copy that, go into main or app.jsx in here now, and right above this div where the images are, I'm going to just start typing out navbar, and cursor in a lot of modern text editors will automatically import everything for me. So if I look back into navbar.jsx, it's exporting this, it's doing all of the things you might need to do in JavaScript. But now we should have a navbar on our front end running. I should be able to refresh in here, and now I see this sign in. So this right here, we're just going to go ahead and hit sign in, and of course it redirects us to sign into Usernado. What do you know? How cool is that? Obviously we're in development mode, but as soon as I hit continue, it's going to ask me for my same test development email. I'm going to select it. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I'm signing into Clerk. It's not actually signing into my app just yet because I need to specify a few more things, but I'm going to verify I'm a human, and there we go. Now I'm logged in into my React application. It was really just that simple. It's unbelievable how cool this is. There's still another thing we need to do, but overall at this point, we have a way to log in and log out users into our very, very simple application in here. And of course, once we actually have our user already set in, it's just going to be able to do that every time. Notice it's also taking my image. So the image that I have for my user that's currently logged in, it's quite literally bringing that in as well. It's giving you everything that you would expect from any sort of authentication. It's super cool. We're now going to take a look at the hooks that Clerk provides so you can use auth tokens or user tokens, and then also take a look at what users can do. So there's two hooks that we're going to take a look at. The first one is going to be use auth. So use auth itself provides a number of different items. The main ones that I would look at are the user ID and the function called get token. So the get token function is what we can use to make a call to our backend. So the way I'm going to go about doing this one is I'm going to go ahead and create a callback function. So if you're not familiar with how React.js works, this part might look a little strange to you, but the idea here is I'm creating a function that will just call this token itself, and then I'll call it in other places. So this is going to be something like handle user data, or maybe something like handle send user data to the backend. It's a long function name, but we're going to go ahead and stick with it. And we'll go ahead and do the use callback method here. Now, the use callback method takes in a function and then a dependency array. So we have a callback function that's in there. So the function itself, I would actually put right inside here, and then we would use the arrow method just like that. So if we have any arguments that we wanted, we would put an argument in here. but inside of this function is really where we're going to go ahead and call this. Now, traditionally speaking, with the UseAuth get token portion, we would actually want this to be an asynchronous function itself so that we can grab the token, something like this, where it's await and get token, and that's how we're going to go ahead and grab that token out. From here, what we could do is we can set up our request headers, and then basically all I would do is say something like authorization, and there's going to be bearer and that token. So let's go ahead and make this a string substitutable string here. And I'll go ahead and add in that token with that $, just like that. And I could really just console log those headers, right? So that might be what you end up doing. In the long run, you would probably actually have a actual fetch request, which would be something like this, where you go ahead and fetch it. In our case, we would do something like localhost 8000. Let's do actually 888. And we'll go ahead and say API hello, something like that. This eventually will be, call Django or FastAPI backend, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about here. And then of course we would come in and add in some options, and those headers are going to be these request headers in here. That's going to be the main option you would have. And then you would basically grab something like if the response is okay, then you would go ahead and console log the response itself. So let's go ahead and say that the data would be await response.json, and then we can console log that data. Otherwise, we would take a look at the error, which I would just go ahead and just console log. Let's go ahead and do our const text and say await response.text, and then we'll console log that. Text. There we go. Okay, so now we've got a function that we can use to call back. You also probably want to pass in this get token as a dependency array. That might not be fully necessary, but there we go. We've got this handle token. So what I want to do is just have a button that will call that. So right underneath Vite and React, I'll go ahead and say button on click, and we'll go ahead and say calling that callback function here. In this case, you actually wouldn't necessarily need to use callback. You could use just the function itself. When it comes to use callback itself, you would do it in something like use effect. You would want to do it in that kind of hook. That's why I typically have use callback in there just as a default, basically. And so I'm going to go ahead and grab this handle send user there, and we'll go ahead and say, trigger backend. We'll go ahead and save that, and let's make sure our project's still running. Looks like it is. I'll refresh in here. I hit trigger backend, and naturally what would happen is an error, right? So it has no way to actually connect to that. But if we look at our object here, we've got authorization headers in here, which is great. So this fetch method here is actually a little bit of a problem. So we would actually want to catch the error there. We'll do that later when we actually implement the backend. The key part of this was getting the headers themselves. Now, the other part about this is we can actually take a look at the user ID that's being passed as well. This would be accessible from the token too, as we'll see when we go into the backend. But if I were to trigger it again, I can now see the headers, and then there's my user ID. This user ID is corresponding to your user in the dashboard in Clerk. So if you go into your users here, you click on one of your users, there is that user ID, which I just copied. It's the same exact one. Super fantastic with that, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward on how we could just get that going. So both of those things are really nice in terms of authentication. There is one more thing that you might want to use, and that's the use user. And so there is the user method as well, which we'd come in here and say user is equal to use user. This gives us a few other options that you just don't have with the use auth. We'll just go ahead and take a look at what that looks like now. So I'll refresh in here, I'll trigger that back in, and this is our user in here. So we've got a lot of things that are going on with this, a lot of things that you might not necessarily use. You've got an image URL in here though. So this URL, I believe, will be the user URL. Let's go ahead and get rid of the quotes and just paste that in. We've got an error. Let me just go ahead and grab it again, and I'll paste it in with no quotes on the front and the end. And that gives me that user profile. And notice it's coming directly from Clerk itself. It's not coming from Google in this case, but it's pretty nice that you've got a bunch of things like that. You also have the user's email address. So if you needed to show that, You totally could. There's a lot of things out of the box that you can just use is the point here, right? We've got updated at. We even have a method to update password. So there's a lot of things that you also might consider doing on the front end as well. Now, those more advanced features we're not really going to look at just yet. What we really want to see is how we can interact with this in the backend, how we can actually have a backend working correctly, whether it's Django, FastAPI, or pretty much any backend. But the point here is we now have that token. So there's one more thing that I want to do as it relates to this project and Docker Compose before we actually implement this and call it a, hey, this stuff is now integrated. One of the challenges in using Docker Compose for development is to remember that you used Docker Compose. That is certainly something that I forget from time to time. But the idea here is when we open up our terminal and I were to navigate into React Clerk and I actually run npm run dev and even -- host and all that, I might get this error right here. Now, this error is not really that obvious as to what is going on or how to solve it. The error itself is related to the node modules. So when it comes to Node.js applications at all, just delete the node modules. That often solves your problem. And that would solve this problem right here, at least temporarily. But what I want to do is I actually want to solve it on a Docker specific look, which means that we're going to be creating a Dockerfile. Now, the Dockerfile is just designing our own container image. So if you look at compose.yaml, we've got this node image in here. We're basically going to take that, add a few steps that we want to happen every single time to set up the environment inside of the container itself. These steps are also good steps to remember just to even set up our own app on our own machine. So the very first thing is going to be the image. We see that we already have an image that we want to use, which was node:/lts-slim. So in our Dockerfile, we can use from and then that image. And right away, that's going to specify our Dockerfile that we want. So with this, even if I did nothing else, I could actually come into my React app here and I can specify a new thing called build. Inside of that build, we can pass in something called context. So the context would be the directory that we're building in, like where we want to build out this image. And of course, that directory is going to be the React Clerk. We're going to go ahead and copy the relative path there. It's literally that, which I like to do // just to know exactly where that is relative to where this file is. So the dot is specifying this file. Then we can also specify a Docker file that we want to use, as in the design file that we want to use, which of course is going to be that actual Docker file right here. Now, a lot of times when you're learning Docker, you're going to start with the Docker file. You would not start with compose.yaml like we did. I think learning from compose.yaml is a lot better because then you can add little things little by little as you see the need for them. This is a good example of that, is making sure our environment is working correctly. So inside of this Dockerfile now, we need to specify what are the things that we want to do within this Dockerfile. Okay, so in other words, I can run npm install npm and then -g. I can actually update the node package manager in there just like that. I could also run other commands that I see fit as well. So if I did npm run or whatever, right? So like what we saw before, where we actually ran the clerk command, or Vite command rather, so npm create, not run, we could actually run something like that. But the thing is, we already have code that's being worked on and being built out. So we probably wouldn't run this. Instead, what we would want to do is we'd want to bring that code over. Well, this Dockerfile is in the same folder as to where that code is. So what I could do is I could just copy like the src folder here and bring it somewhere on this project. Let's say, for example, app src. We could do something like that. Or I could just copy everything in this folder and bring it over into /app. Hey, this might look familiar, and that's because when we first started with Docker Compose, our volumes essentially did the same thing. Docker Compose, though, is for the whole project. We're going to have several different projects in here, and they will all be listed in Docker Compose. Whereas the Dockerfile itself is about the folder that it's in, the actual app that it's working on. So once we actually copy over this entire folder, we're going to get everything that's in here, including package.json, which means that I should be able to do npm install just like that. But the thing is, we need to make sure that we're specifying our working directory. So we could do it where we cd app, or /app and then run npm install, or I could just do something like workdir /app and then work off of that. And in the working directory in this case works exactly like compose.yaml in here. In fact, I can actually now comment this out because my Dockerfile specifies that working directory. Compose.yaml will override whatever you write there. So now we've got our copying over, we're updating it, we're running npm install, and we're doing all of the stuff that we need to do in order to set up our environment. The final thing here would be the actual command that we want to run at the very end, which would really just be this command right here. Now again, Docker Compose can override that command right inside here, or we can actually call it in here. We can do it in both places, and there's a lot of different ways on how you can call this command. And so normally what you would do is something like npm run and then dev. You would separate them out all like that. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and just add in the 2 dashes here and also host as well. This is not production ready, so keep that in mind. You might even want to call this dockerfile.dev and then come back into compose.yaml and change that to being .dev, just so you know it's definitely the development environment altogether. So one other huge thing that we can do now is we should be able to remove these node modules in here. And so I'm going to go ahead and delete the node modules in here. The next thing I want to do is the way I'm going to sync these volumes is now going to be different. The first thing I'm going to do is index.html. I'm going to sync it over to app and index.html. I may never need to change that whatsoever, but I will sync it over just so that I can if I need to. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and sync over is the Clerk app and then also to source like that, the same exact way. Oops, this should be /react clerk/index. Make sure that those things are synced. And then I can also do the same thing with the public folder. In other words, I don't need to sync everything. I just need to sync some things here. And that's kind of the point. And so /app is the root of where we're going to be storing it in our container. And so now we've got a little bit better of an environment to work off of. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that command here. And now I'm going to go ahead and run the docker compose up command, or better yet, we'll separate it out a little bit to build React app and go ahead and hit enter. This will build out the container image for us with each step that we specified. And if we did it correctly, it will do it in a way that makes sense. Now, this npm install makes a whole lot of sense because, well, we have package.json that's going to need a bunch of things installed in there. Now, this might grow as of now. It's not really going to grow, but we've got our React app built now, and now I can just run docker compose and up and then hit enter, and this should actually build out our container image, and there it is. And everything should be basically the same as it was, but now we're going it based off of an environment that we have complete control over, and we won't need to specify some of these other things in here any longer. I will leave them in there as notes, and I'll also even leave in the old React Clerk copy stuff in here. But the point is, we should now have a development environment that works for both. Notice that the node modules is no longer showing up here. If I come into app and change this to, let's say, where we got Vite and React, and then we'll go ahead and put in plus Clerk in here and hit save, it automatically changes. And the changes just sync because we have those volumes mounted. If those volumes were not mounted, we would have to rebuild everything. In other words, I would have to basically come in here and do docker compose down, take the whole thing down, do docker compose up, -- build, hit enter, which will actually rebuild everything. That's just another shortcut to rebuild it. Or you could specify which one you want to build, and that would actually rebuild the app altogether and make those changes for you. So having the volumes mounted on there is critical to make sure that they're syncing all of the time. And of course, our actual command in here lends really well for syncing and refreshing this stuff, which I think is actually pretty cool. Okay, so realistically though, there's one more thing that we need to change, and that has to do with those node modules. So I still haven't really solved the problem of, locally working. So if I do npm run dev on my local machine, I might be like, oh, Vite not found. I'm going to go ahead and do npm install here, hit enter, and then boom, my node modules are back. So this is where another file comes in handy called docker ignore. And so that would be just like your git ignore in many ways, where you would actually bring in the node modules in here. And I believe it works mostly like that, with the 2 stars at the end to get everything. But the idea is we don't want those node modules copied over. So our Dockerfile here is maybe a little too generic in the sense that it's going to try and copy everything over. So all I really want to do here is run docker compose down, and then I want to rebuild it and just make sure that everything is up and working. So we'll do up and then -- build, make sure that that node modules isn't conflicting with our actual project's node modules. And in this case, it looks like it is because of that image and because of those, node modules in there. So back into our Docker ignore here, let's go ahead and get rid of everything. I'll just leave it as is, and we'll go ahead and build it again and see if we run into those same exact issues. Now, if you were going into production, you would have the same issues you would need to face or at least solve, right? So me putting the wrong Docker ignore in here had catastrophic effects on building out my project, which is why you'd want to really test these things out. And the node modules package is a really good use case for when that may or may not happen. So that's actually pretty important. Now, the nice thing about Vite is it already has this git ignore in here, so it's already doing a bunch of things that you would probably want to ignore in your Docker ignore as well. They work basically the exact same way, but the idea here is we just want to make sure that that's in there, because in our Dockerfile, we have this copy command. This respects, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and put a note right above it and say copy respects.docker ignore. That's the point. That's the whole point of all of that, to make sure that that's working well. So this is to say we now have a really solid established environment to be able to build out Node.js applications inside of a Docker Compose environment with our users. If you haven't noticed, I've been talking more about Docker in this part than I have been Clerk. A big part of the reason is Clerk is really simple to implement. Docker can be really simple, but it also can start to get complicated when you make the wrong changes here and there. But we'll still do some more Docker things, and of course, we still need to do some more Clerk things. Let's keep going. Now that we can register users, log them in, log them out on the front end, it's time to build out our back end. For that, we're going to be using a Python web application called Django. Django itself is a little bit more involved just to get it to the hello world inside of Docker Compose, which of course is what we've been using to develop. So what we want to do now is we want to build out the service for the Django app. To do this, I'm going to jump into the root of my project here, and I'm going to go ahead and call this Django_Clerk, and we're going to go ahead and hit enter. Now I will point out that there's a git ignore file now in the root of my project, and what you will also know is that git is also in here as well. So it will be tracking all the code going forward based on the lesson that it's on. But the point here is we need to build out our Django app. The way we're going to do this is by starting with a Dockerfile this time and starting with something called requirements.txt. Normally what I would say is you need to install Python and you need to run a few commands to get your Django project up and running. So we're going to do that same sort of idea, but now through the lens of a Dockerfile. And so hopefully what we did in React Clerk helps you understand how this ends up working. So the very first thing is we needed to define something like from. We need to define a working directory, which I typically use as /app. Then we need to copy some files, and we need to run some commands, and then we need to run cmd, right? So that's kind of what we're going to be doing right now. The big question to start would be from what exactly? Well, going back into hub.docker.com, what we can do here is we can actually look for a Python application. So search for Python, Docker official image, and then what you'll see at the very top is, of course, Python. And so in here is what we'll use. You can go into the tags and you can grab latest probably. I'm going to specify 3.13 as the version I'm going to use, and bullseye. So that's going to be a little bit bigger than what we saw before. You could probably get away with using slim, but I've found that bullseye works pretty much the most reliably when it comes to Python itself and installing all sorts of third-party system level packages you might need. So back into our Dockerfile here, I'm just going to do Python : paste that in. Boom, we now have our image. Our working directory is just fine. The copy command, well, we can copy this whole file in it, or the whole directory if we want. And what we would end up doing is copying it to /app. That might be what you end up doing. But in this case, especially with Django, you don't need to copy everything. What you'll need to copy is the actual source code, which we're going to put in an SRC folder. Notice it's empty right now. So all I'm going to do here is copy ./source into the app folder, into the working directory. This means that then, if you know Django especially, you would come down here, you would put double quotes, Python, manage.py, and then run server. Now, we're not quite done with that command yet, but that's where we're working. I realize we don't have Django code yet, so we still need to add the Django code. But for now, this is getting to the point where we're getting closer to what we want. Now, the next thing, of course, is going to be the requirements.txt. This is where we can specify our Django project. So in my case, I want to use greater than or equal to 5.2, but less than 5.3. If you were to jump into djangoproject.com, you will come to learn that 5.2 is the latest LTS that was just released. So I recommend using that one or whatever the next LTS is going to be when that's released, depending on if you're watching this then. And more than likely, as it pertains to Django, a lot of this stuff is still going to work at that time in, what's that, 2027. So nevertheless, we are now here. We've got a requirements file in here. So that's one more thing I want to bring in, and I'm going to bring it in like this with ./requirements.txt. This time though, I'm going to specify a different location for it. I'm going to put it into temp requirements.txt. This is where I typically put it, whether I'm deploying it directly to a container or deploying it directly to a virtual machine. The requirements file is essentially a temporary file that doesn't need to be right next to the actual code that we're going to be running. But instead, we just need to make sure that we know that, so that then when I go to run pip install, I am using this requirements file. So pip install -r requirements.txt to bring everything in. Now we're super close to being ready to go, but we're not quite there, and it has everything to do with Python virtual environments. Now, when we created our React app, it created these node modules for us. What that means is the code and the third-party packages are all in one place. They're all in this single folder right here. Python applications can work that way and often do in development. But when it comes to containers, it's often better to not work that way exactly. Instead, having your environment folder and files somewhere else. That environment folder and files is called a virtual environment, and typically what you do is run python -m venv. This is the command to create a virtual environment. Then you can specify where you want it. In this case, I'm going to put in OTP/venv. This is where you would store optional packages inside of Linux, which is of course where our Dockerfile is going to work. As soon as we do something like that, I want to make sure that all of my commands to follow use that virtual environment. The way I do that is by setting an environment variable for that path. This means that this version of Python down here is using this virtual environment, which also means that this version of pip is installing to this virtual environment. That's a really key part of this. And yes, in containers, you want to do this as well, so that any sort of Python application you're adding, any third-party package you're adding will still work regardless of what's on the system at large, any Python package on the system. So we could also do another thing in here, which would be run and pip install pip, and then -- upgrade. Now feel free to use other virtual environment managers. Something like UV is a really, really popular one now and probably worth using. So like something like UV itself. There are other ones, Poetry, Pipfile. There's a lot of them out there. I'm just using the one that's built in to Python itself because it is pretty great itself. Okay, so now that we've got this Dockerfile, I don't actually have any code. It's just an empty folder here, but I have enough to build out compose.yaml, to actually build out the container itself. So inside of compose.yaml, I'm going to go ahead and copy the React declarations and paste it right above. And we'll go ahead and tab it in a little bit. And now this one's just going to be called Django app. And we only just need to change a few things. First off, the build context. I can also get rid of the comments that I have in there. But the build context is the first one. I want to copy this relative path now. Hey, what do you know? Django Clerk, no big deal. Dockerfile, Dockerfile.deb actually still makes sense. So I want to rename mine to Dockerfile.dev. That works. Next up, we want to come down here, volumes. what files do we actually want to store in our container? In my case, I really just want SRC, and that's the only thing. So once again, we'll do Django Clerk. This time it's going to be src:/app. App is where all of our code is going to live. We don't need it in two places. We just need it in one, which is just going to be app. When it comes to the React app, we had more files that can affect the actual final project. In the case of Django, all of those files are going to be inside of SRC. That's the point. Next up is, of course, going to be the env file. We can still inject that. The cool thing about this that I really like is then we can actually use, import OS and then os.environ in terms of Python itself without any other third-party packages whatsoever. The final one is going to be the port that we want to use. What port are we going to use for the Django project, which I'm going to use 4 8s here. So 88888. Just like that. Now, for those of you who know Django already, you'll know in the Dockerfile here, this Python run server automatically goes to port 8000. So what we want to do is we want to change it so it goes to 8888. That's one way on how we can change it. Now, another thing as it pertains to running this on a host, in the case of Docker Compose, this is kind of the host that's going on, or Docker's the host. We would also want to do 0.0.0.0:. This right here is very similar to what we did with Clerk, where we actually had that -- host in here. Those basically do the same thing, roughly speaking. So there we go. So now we've got at 88888. Now, every once in a while with Docker files, you might see something called expose. We don't need to put that in our Docker file. Most of the time, those things or not export, but expose, those things would be done in compose.yaml, which is exactly what this is doing right here. Great, so now we can build out our Docker app and then create our Django project. Let's go ahead and do that now. So what I want to do is run docker compose build, and then we're going to literally just build the app, just like that. So that's going to take a moment for it to build. This would have to happen if I also ran docker compose run. Docker is intelligent enough to know if a container is not working correctly, and then it would actually build it out for us. But what we should see in here is exactly this, right? So we should see that it's pulling Python. I did see that it was installing some of the requirements. I don't see it any longer, but it was in there installing some of the requirements, which is great. So now I can run the docker compose run Django app bin/bash. This should bring us right into /app here. Sure enough, it does. If I were to echo hello world into a hello.txt file, this should actually go right inside of SRC, and there it is. Great. So of course I don't actually need that, so I can go ahead and delete it. What I want to do though is run Django-admin. If everything was done correctly, this command will work. Sure enough, running Django-admin by itself doesn't work really, but it does have no error. It actually allows me to run it. So now I can actually run the Django start command, which is Django-admin, and then start project CFE home and a period. So I'll explain the period in a moment, but every Django project that I make uses the exact same name. So if I hit enter, I see that CFE home is here. This is where my settings module is always going to be. I do that for every single one of my projects. You can see that on my Git repo at cfe.sh/github. They all are basically this. So what we've got here now is the Django project. That period there, put it inside of SRC. So we have manage.py now. And all I need to do to augment this a little bit is update my settings. And I want to update it to allow all hosts here, just so that we can see our project running. I'm now going to go ahead and run the docker compose down command. So let's go ahead and do docker compose down, and then we'll go ahead and remove orphans if there are any. There might be, but I'll go ahead and run that. And the point here now, the next point would be to actually see the front end running, or both of them running. That is the Django front end and the React front end. Django still will, of course, have a front end. So all I want to do now is docker compose up. If you have to rebuild things, you can just do -- build. More on that very soon. But for now, I'll do docker compose up, hit enter. This, of course, is going to build everything. If we need to save anything inside of our Django project, we can. Notice that if I do save something, then a bunch of things are output to Django. We see the development server here, and there is that location that's being run. That, of course, is because of this right here. It doesn't say 127 like it would most of the time if you didn't put 000. So with this in mind, I should now be able to open that up. So let's go into localhost 8888, hit enter, and there you go. We now have Django and our React, Vite, and Clerk app running. It's now time to actually integrate the two. There is another step we need to do with Django to integrate the two, but overall, we're now in a pretty good spot. And if I do Docker compose down, this will take everything down, of course. And if I do -v, it will delete some of the attached volumes that aren't related to actual files themselves. We now have two custom Docker images for our two services, our front end and our back end. Now, one of the things that Docker Compose can do is it can automatically rebuild the container when something changes. Now, the files won't need to trigger this rebuild, right? So they're already being synced, and the way they actually work is they will rebuild on their own thanks to how we're calling it. Like in the case of Django itself, when you save a file that's related to Django, it will restart. In the case of React and Vite, when you actually run the dev version, it will automatically rebuild as well when the file changes itself. So what we really need to do is the entire container. So if a requirements change for any of the packages, we might need to rebuild the container for that. Or if the Dockerfile changes. So to make that happen inside of our services in each one, we're going to go ahead and add in a new argument here, and it's going to be develop. And then in here, we want to do watch. So we can add in a bunch of different watch parameters. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and do the action called rebuild, and then we're going to track a specific path. So in the case of the Dockerfile, for example, I'm going to copy this relative path, and I'll just go ahead and put that in like that, and that will rebuild the entire container image when the Docker container file change or the Docker file changes. So let's see what this looks like with Docker Compose up and now -- watch. We hit enter. This will allow for it to automatically change, which is not going to be necessarily obvious when you first run it, but when we make a change to the Docker file, it will be very obvious. So inside of dockerfile.dev, for example, if I were to do something like this, where I did run pip install gunicorn, let's say for instance, that would prepare us for production. I save it. As soon as I save it, it goes to rebuild this container image itself, which didn't take that long in this case. It just created it really quickly. But the idea here is if the file does change, we want to make sure we trigger a change in the development process all across the board. This would be also true with the requirements.txt. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it right underneath. And then we'll just change this one to requirements.txt so that that changes as well. So in this case, we would change something like the Django course headers or Python requests, a bunch of third-party packages we might want to include in that watch phase. This way we don't have to tear everything down and rebuild it every time we need to make a change. So naturally I would want to do this same thing within my React app itself. So we're going to go ahead and bring that one in as well. And now we want to see what is it that we're going to change in here. Well, it's going to be related to package.json for sure. And then also the Dockerfile inside of React Clerk. I'll copy that one as well. And so that also would end up rebuilding it. I'm not so sure if we would need really anything else in here that would require for the entire thing to rebuild necessarily. Maybe something like Vite config would rebuild it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that one as well, just to make sure that if we do change any of the configuration, we would also put that in there too. And then once you make those changes to Docker Compose, you will have to close out your Docker Compose app and maybe do Docker Compose down and then remove orphans if there are any. And then we would just bring it back up with that -- watch. That way, any changes that happen will make changes. One of the examples in React is you might want to change this to a different port. Let's say, for instance, you want to use port 3001. Let's do 3001 like that. To make that change, you would go into Vite then, and you would come in here and do server, and then you would add port in there, you save it, and then as soon as that saves, that should actually rebuild the container itself, assuming that it was tracked and saved correctly, and there it went. It actually did rebuild it just like that, and there is the new port now, which we could then open up on our local machine, or in theory, we would be able to open it up on our local machine. I think in this case, I actually also changed Docker Compose, so that might be another thing we want to also watch, which would be rebuild as well, and we'll just go ahead and do the path of compose.yaml. That way it does rebuild everything when I make changes to this file too. That actually makes a whole lot of sense as well. So let's go ahead and bring it back down. We'll bring it back up again. I'll refresh in there. There's Vite being at 3001. Let's change it to 3002 all across the board. And just to verify that everything is up and running. So we should see that it does rebuild, and I'll just go ahead and go to 3002 and basically see how long does it take. Probably wouldn't take that long, although it might take a moment for it to rebuild. Looks like it's there, 3002. Looks like that's looking good, but I think we probably have to actually restart our Docker Compose again. So that's the one caveat that we would probably have to do, is just rerun Docker Compose up when we make changes. In other words, I'm going to get rid of it from the rebuild command. So if we do change compose.yaml, we'll just have to remember to restart things as we see fit. So that's a really convenient way to make sure that our environment is always working as intended, and basically what we want to do going forward as we develop more and more. By default, a front end can't call an arbitrary backend. They usually have to be on the same domain and maybe even the same port. Otherwise, we can trigger the backend and we will see that it's been blocked by a CORS policy. This is cross-origin resource sharing, and basically is a security process that we want to make sure that we implement in our project. So the question then is, how do we actually prevent CORS from happening and get a different error, not a CORS error? Well, the way it's going to happen is through the Django CORS header package. This is a great one, which I'm going to go ahead and bring in to my project on requirements.txt. We'll save it in just like that. I'm also going to jump into my settings to configure this. The first one is inside of installed apps. We're going to go ahead and add in our third-party apps in here, and this is going to be CORS headers. And then inside of my middleware here, right before common middleware, we're going to go ahead and do our CORS headers.middleware.CORS middleware. Okay. Then the next thing is going to be our cross-origin regular expressions. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste these just like that. So what we've got here is localhost with any port. We've got 127.0.0.1 with any port, and then the internal Docker host is also in there as well. That's something that we may or may not use at some point. But the idea here is all of these origins are regular expressions for a front end that can actually connect to our backend. This is mostly for debug, right? So if it's in debug mode, which Django is by default, then we would do something like that. Otherwise, we would probably want to specify very specific domains in that could be our front end. But in our case, we're still learning how to connect all of these things. So this is something that's important, but not a huge deal during development other than just getting it working. So as we recall back into our front end, we did call our Django backend right here at API hello. We'll probably have to come back to that, but at this point, assuming that Docker Compose is up and watch is working, it should have refreshed everything for us. We didn't run migrations yet, which is something we probably want to do. But let's just go ahead and refresh on our front end and hit trigger backend. Now I get a completely different thing coming back for me. I get a 404 error in here for the response. And here's all the text that's come back. So this is actually showing us that our React project is now attempting to reach our Django project. And the only way that it ended up working was because of Django CORS headers and adding in those little security features that we had. Let's get our Hello World API endpoint working in our Django project so our React project can call it. Before we do that, you absolutely could use the Django REST framework or Django Ninja to actually handle your API. Or you could just build out custom ones with Django directly, which is actually a really straightforward process. So inside of CFE home here, I'm going to go ahead and create a file called api.py, and I'm going to go ahead and do from django.http. We're going to import the JSON response class, and then we're going to go ahead and define our Hello World API view, which takes in a request by default from Django, and then we're going to return back the JSON response class, which will just simply be Hello World, and that's it. So obviously there's a lot of things that we can customize in terms of this class itself, But now that I've got this view here, I'm going to import it into my URLs. So we'll go ahead and do from .api. We're going to import the actual Hello World API view. And then I'll go ahead and create a path for API/hello, something along those lines. I believe that's what we called it in React. Then I'll go ahead and bring in that view just like that. Now, part of the reason these squiggly lines are here is because the actual cursor does not have a virtual environment that is activated. It has Python in here as the language, but it's not using the Docker container virtual environment, so it doesn't think that Django is installed, because on my local machine outside of Docker, it is not installed. You definitely could if you wanted to, but for now, I'm going to leave it as is. Okay, so what should happen is the project should have already been refreshed, right? And so if I jump into React and Vite and hit trigger backend, it should now give me the actual response back. And of course, the reason it's giving that response back is because in app.jsx, we can see we called the exact same API endpoint that we just routed, that we just configured out. And so now these two things are pretty much integrated. So the next part is really just bringing in Clerk into our API endpoint. Let's see how. We are almost ready to implement the Clerk SDK for Python, but before we do, I want to go ahead and make sure that I implement the environment variables for Clerk as well, the secret keys that we might want to have. So jumping into the Clerk dashboard, go into Configure, scroll on down, and on the left-hand side, you'll see API keys. You're going to want to grab your secret key. We could also grab our publish key, but I'm going to go with just the secret key and copy it. Now, we're in development mode, so sharing this key doesn't actually matter that much. But in production mode, the secret key is something you never want to share. The publish key can be in your front-end code. That's okay. The secret key cannot be. Just to reiterate that from before, but the idea here is our Django project will have access to that secret key. Our React project does not need it, which hopefully should tell you that our .envs need to be different. As in, inside of compose.yaml, we've got .env here, as well as here. We need to change that. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go ahead and do .env.backend.local. That's what I'm going to now name my new .env. And then we're going to use clerk_secret_key and paste in that value, just like this. Make sure there's no spaces there. You don't need quotes on the inside or the outside of it, as in this does not need to be quoted like that. You can do it, but it's not necessary. The main part here then is now that we've got this env backend.local, we need to make sure that Docker Compose is using that for our Django project. Now, what we could do is we could still use the other .env if we wanted to. I like making it just one to make sure that we are very hyper specific with our environment variables. So .env.backend.local is now going to be our Django one. You could also just call it Django, but we might want to reuse this in other places, not just in Django. So now that we've got that, I also want to add in one more thing into this, and that's going to be my Django secret key. And I'll just go ahead and say ABC123 for now. Why am I doing this? Well, it's going to show me whether or not the environment variables are working correctly inside of Django itself. So into my Django project, I'm going to go ahead and change settings.py. What I want to do is I want to import OS. Now, if you've been following along with me for any length of time, you'll know that I like to use Python decouple. So from decouple and import config, I don't need to do that with my current environment setup. You can, and I do recommend it. It is still a great package, but we're going to leave it nice and simple and just go ahead and use os.environ.get and loading that in. Some of you also might use another one that does .env loaders. That's not necessary, especially in this case, but the idea overall is we're going to use the built-in Python way to load in environment variables. So now we've got our Django secret key down there. I'm going to go ahead and copy this and go to the very bottom, and we're going to go ahead and do our clerk, config. We'll paste in that, and we'll just call this our clerk secret key in here, like that. And we would probably want to assert maybe not in here, but we'll go ahead and do it right now just to make sure that it's working. So let's go ahead and bring down our Docker Compose because we've made changes to Docker Compose itself or compose.yaml. So we'll go ahead and do Docker Compose down, and then we'll go ahead and bring it right back up just to make sure this is working. And I do have this assert error. This should say is not none, not is none. And so assuming that that was done correctly, let's just restart the app itself. We should probably get no errors with that. And that is also why I put the secret key in here, is because if I go to my Django project, if I don't have a secret key loading, the Django project won't load either. So it's kind of both reasons for that. I'm going to get rid of this assert command because we don't need it. But now that we've got all of this, I want to make sure that my Django project is actually loading this or extracting the correct things from Clerk. But we're really in the spot where we can start doing that now that our environment variables are even further set up for this project. Let's go ahead and implement the Clerk SDK for Python. Now, before we do, let's recap as to what's going on. First off, your front end, whether it's React, Next.js, iOS, Android, that will present the user to log in. We already saw that. They can also log out. Now, this front-end version of Clerk will enrich API requests with a JOT token, an authorization token for that user. Once that token comes into the backend, that's where the Clerk SDK for Python is going to come in and allow our backends to be able to handle that data or that user itself. So that's what we're going to do right now. So let's go ahead and jump into the documentation, which is currently on the GitHub Python SDK stuff. So we're going to scroll down and we're going to go ahead and grab the Clerk backend API package. We're going to go ahead and bring it into requirements.txt. Then, of course, I think our project is still running, so it should actually update and load. If it doesn't, just go ahead and bring it down and then bring it back up. Now what we want to do is scroll on down, or actually go back into the table of contents, and we want to look for request authentication, because that's what we're doing here. So this is a simple function that could absolutely be turned into like a decorator or maybe even middleware. What I'm going to do is just use it in one single view so I can see all of the logic that might be coming through from this process. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this first, and we're going to jump back into our Django project into api.py, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it in. Now, not surprisingly, we already have the Clerk secret key that is, of course, in our settings.py, which is where we're going to load it. This right here would technically work, though, because it's still getting the environment variables. But when it comes to Django, the best practices are to have all of your settings in settings.py, including ones that are being loaded in like this. So that's what we're going to go ahead and use. The way we're going to do that is we're going to go in from django.conf, we're going to import settings, and then we'll go ahead and set settings.clerk secret key just like that. And that's going to be our bearer auth. That's what we're going to start out with. Look, I'm just going based off of their documentation here. So that's what we're going to use as well. I'm also going to reorganize it a little bit so that the packages are imported a little differently than they are right here. Now, the next thing about this is we notice that in this function of is signed in, it says request. Django by default has a request that comes in as well. So my assumption is that I can actually use the same request in both places. This one says http.request, but I would imagine the request object is going to be very similar. This is a Django request, not an HTTP request. In other words, I want to just go with the assumption that I can just do something like that, and now my Django request will be fed into the Clerk stuff. I believe that's going to work. Now, the other reason I believe it's going to work is because if you look in the documentation, you can see that it says Django, Flask, and other Python web frameworks, which I would imagine would include FastAPI as well. But of course, we'll test that when the time comes. Next up, what we need to do is the authorized parties. But before we do that, let's just see if this portion is working. I'm going to go ahead and print out the request state here once it comes back. And one of the other things that you might notice is it had something for is signed in, which I'll go ahead and print out as well right next to each other. So there's our new hello world. All we would need to verify on our front end inside of app.jsx is that we are actually using the bearer token, that JOT token that's coming through from the Clerk React package. And sure enough, we are using that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into Vite React. I'll go ahead and hit trigger backend. This still responds with the correct data. But of course, if we look in the console now, what we should end up seeing, I think, especially if I hit save, it'll refresh that state. We get the request state in here. It says it's signed out. The authorized party claim does not match the authorized parties, as in, let's scroll on down, authorized parties. Well, that doesn't match. My front end does not match what's listed here. So we could change that really easily. I could copy this and I could paste it right in here. I also do not want that trailing slash. Let's get rid of that. It probably still won't work if you have that trailing slash. Now, in the long run, I would probably want this to be an environment variable as well. But for now, since we're just testing these things out, let's leave it as is. That would also be true with the backend command as well, which again, we'll optimize later. But now that I've got that, let's go ahead and save it. And once again, I will run trigger backend. The backend call ended up working. If I just go ahead and save in Python, I should see the actual app kind of flush out all of the printed statements, which there's my request state. It gives me a bunch of stuff. And then it also says true or false on whether or not this user is signed in. And of course, the user is signed in, which is great. So what we can do now is we can take this a little bit further. And this is from my own digging, which you can grab the payload from that state by doing request state.payload. And then in there, we can get something called the sub, which I would just say the actual Clerk user ID, which is payload.get and sub. That's it. So now I'm going to go ahead and replace our request state with that user ID there. We'll go ahead and save that. We'll trigger that back in again, save again in Python so then things refresh a little bit. Let's go ahead and try that one more time, triggering that back in. Looks like I got an API call that's invalid somewhere. And we've got payload. That's incorrect. It should be payload. Oopsies. There we go. Let's try that again. Trigger that backend. Looks like it's working now. Save in Django. And now we've got a user ID in there, which I could go ahead and copy and go back into the Clerk dashboard under my users. I'll go ahead and select the user I know is logged in, and then I'll do a quick Command F with that user ID. And sure enough, it matches that actual user. So naturally from here, we can start using more of the Clerk SDK as we see fit. That's not something I'm gonna do just yet. What we do have though is the information about our user in our backend now. So really from here going forward, it would just be a matter of doing different API calls as we see fit on our backend and making like middleware that could then potentially turn this into an actual Django user. But overall, the point here is our front end and our back end are now communicating through Clerk. It's fantastic. We're now going to go ahead and get the Clerk user data inside of Django using, of course, that Python SDK, which we've already initialized. This process is really simple, as we'll see in just a moment. But what we're emulating here is very similar to the front end inside of React, where we've got this use user hook. We're going to be doing something pretty similar, but in the back end itself. Now, the nice thing about this is once we have this user data, we will be able to store it into our databases if we want to. And of course, we do want to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that very soon as far as the storage is concerned. For now, I just want to grab the user data, and it's literally as simple as this. So I'm going to go ahead and say the Clerk, and we'll just call this our Clerk user. And this is going to be our sdk.users.get. Then we pass in user ID equaling to the Clerk user ID. And then that will give us a Clerk user, which we could print out and see in just a moment. So the idea here is like, where do you actually get this information itself? That's going to be the first question you might have. Of course, it's in the Clerk SDK Python documentation. So if you were to come in here, you can see all of the different things that are available, resources and operations. You can scroll on down. Obviously, there's a lot to them. What we are looking for here is, of course, our users. So just going into users, this, of course, is going to be the vast majority of things in here. Notice that we can actually verify a password. We can do all sorts of stuff with our users that you would do with Django in general. But in our case, we're just getting the user. So we've got this retrieve user here. We just take a look at that, and the example gives us the parameter in there of user ID, which of course, there is that same parameter also listed out in the documentation there as well. So this is actually fairly straightforward. This is a lot like how Django works anyway. If you think about it with the user model, it's user.objects.get, and then it would be something like ID is ID. So we'll come back to something like that. But the idea now is we've got our user in here. Let's go ahead and save it out. And what I want to do is in my front end, I want to actually send back this user data. Now, what we can actually see with our data is it's actually a Pydantic model, which means that we can actually come in here and go into serialization, and we can actually do something called model dump. So if you actually take a look at model dump, there's actually two different ways on how to do model dump, but this should give us the actual data itself. So if I come in here and do model dump, I should be able to see the dictionary values, the Python dictionary values that are coming through in there. Now, the reason you would use the JSON dump instead would be to ensure that none of the Python objects are in there any longer. So the JSON dump would be something you would want to return at some point. And the way we would do that, of course, would be our final data. We'll go ahead and say our output. Let's do our clerk user JSON, and that's going to be our model user.model dump JSON. And then we would just go ahead and do something like JSON.loads in here to load that data. So it's going to dump it into a JSON string, and then we need to use Python to reload it back in there. So I'm going to go ahead and import JSON in here. Now, of course, I'm going to show you why this is in just a moment, and I'm going to go ahead and print out both the model dump and the JSON user dump. So let's go ahead and save that. Jump back into our front end here, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm logged in, which of course I am. I'm going to go ahead and trigger my backend there, and I should get everything working. There should be no errors whatsoever. I do get these warnings we'll look at in just a moment, but if I save it again, I see the refresh down here, and now I can see all of this data. So we're getting the user data in here twice. The thing is, when we scroll up a little bit and we are looking at just the model dump, what you'll see is there's this object in here. So that object, you can't respond back with JSON itself, which if we scroll down a little bit, we see that it just says object of user. So that's really the difference here, is just to make sure the dictionary is correct overall. But the nice thing about using something like the actual Pydantic model is you can actually do dot notation for this. So you can do something like dot ID, you can do dot username, you can do clerk user dot primary email address ID, and you could look at all of those different things because that's how Pydantic models work. And part of the reason I knew it was a Pydantic model was twofold. Number one, the warnings we see on here are related to Pydantic serialization. They're just warnings, there's not errors in there, but of course that's probably going to change over time, and you can see that it says Pydantic in there. Another way you could learn about this is by saying something like help and then grabbing the response user in there, and you would be able to see that as well. But in our case, I want to go ahead and print out the user ID, username, and all that, and then I'm going to go ahead and refresh on my page here, trigger the backend. We should get no errors in there. I save it again just to refresh the output. And what we see, of course, if I scroll up enough, I will see the user ID, no username, and then the the primary email address ID that's in there as well. So a lot of these things we will definitely use and come back to. The point here is that we now have access to the SDK, which we'll be able to use to sync this data with our Django backend. That's going to be a key part of all of this in terms of the SDK itself. Now, what we will want to do is also take out the request stuff in here. So when we grab our request, we're going to want to grab it and save it a little bit differently. So I'm going to define a function called let's call it get clerk user ID from request, and just pass in the request here, and then basically grabbing all of this same data. And then we'll paste this in here, and then I'll return back the clerk user ID. Of course, if the user is not signed in, we'll say something like if not signed in, then we'll return back none. You could return back true or false and stuff like that, but I'm going to just go ahead and return it like this. So now I'm going to have a new function in here that I can call to get this clerk user ID, and we'll go ahead and pass in the request there. And then of course, if the SDK is not implemented just yet, you would probably also want to bring that down as well, just like that. Okay, so if the user is not, the user is none, so we'll go ahead and say if, in the request, if not user, then we'll go ahead and return the JSON response, and I'll go ahead and say detail and please log in, something like that, and then add in a status code in here of 400. Let's just double check that that's working with changing that back to just simply, not, and we've got the wrong argument here. This should be probably status, I think. Let's try that one, and we'll refresh, and there we go. So we got a please log in here. And so now it's sort of working. Let's go ahead and put this back to not clerk ID, save it again, and then we'll trigger it again. This time we get that data back, which also means that I should be able to actually send back the actual user data now to the front end if I wanted to go that route. So we'll go ahead and save that now, and we'll take a look. Let's trigger that back in again, and now we get that same exact user data, or at least very similar of user data from the actual front end itself, right? It's slightly different because one is Python, one is JavaScript. You can even see that in the casing in there on how this data comes out. One is going to be snake case for Python. The other one's going to be camel case for JavaScript. So the last thing I want to do here at this point is to silence those warnings for now. I think that these will be gone in the future. I don't imagine those like persisting for very long, but as soon as I silence them, then I get a little bit cleaner of a terminal output. But the point is here now that we can have that data, I just want to render out that user data inside of React so that I can start building out what I want for an actual user model. So we're going to kind of do those things hand in hand to start building out a custom Django user model. When you create a new user in Django, you typically select a username and password. That username that gets stored into the database as a unique username. Nobody else can take that username. Now, if we think about how we did it with Clerk and of course our front end, and we go to sign in, you could pass in an email address, or you can use a third-party provider like Google. I'm going to go ahead and log in with Google. I want to point out the fact that nowhere on here did I provide a username in that flow process. Now, this is also true with something like Django AllAuth. If you logged in with Google with Django AllAuth, you still wouldn't necessarily provide a username. AllAuth might actually create one for you. Sometimes you also can provide one, but the point is Django itself is built around the username field. In the case of Clerk, it is not. You can actually add and remove the username field whenever you want to. So if you go into the dashboard here under configure, you can add in that username field, save it just like that. Now, for purposes of this demo portion, I can go ahead and delete this user altogether. Not a big deal to delete users in development, especially. Then going back into my front end here, I'm going to sign in again. I'm going to go ahead and continue with Google, log in, do all that sort of stuff in here. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in, well, it's going to prompt me, hey, are you human? Cool, we're human. Now you can add in a user here, which I'll go ahead and add in a username. Now I've got a username field. Great, that's pretty cool. But what if I went back into the dashboard and decided later, I actually don't want username fields anymore. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove that. We'll save it. What ends up happening? Let's take a look at a user in our dashboard here. And if we take a look, we see that there is no username field in here, although it is something that was stored. It's not enabled, but it was stored at one point. So we do still have that username field. It's just not currently active, right? And so if we go back into our front end, we can see this as well. There's that username field. If I were to refresh in here and take a look again, it's gone, right? So that's actually really cool, but it gives us a little bit of insight as to what we need to do with our Django user model itself. We can't associate the Clerk user with a Django user the standard Django way. So we need to customize the Django user model itself. And just like the username itself, we also cannot associate based off of the email address, because you can just add as many email addresses as you want. So what we're going to do instead, hopefully is fairly obvious, or maybe not. We are going to use the Clerk user ID. This is going to become our Django username. This is not actually a Django username in the sense that it's human readable, but it is going to be a Django username, at least for the Django system that we are building out right now. Let's go ahead and create our own custom user model. So the way this is going to work is we're going to go ahead and jump into Docker Compose run our Django app and then bin/bash. And then we'll go ahead and run python manage.py, start app, and we'll call it accounts. This, of course, will create the scaffolding for a new Django app, in which case we're going to go ahead and define our user model in here. So before we actually take a look at the documentation, let's think about the fields we want to have in here. So I'm going to go ahead and say class custom user, and it's going to be models.model. Now, I mentioned before that we want to actually build this around Clerk, so I'm going to go ahead and say my Clerk user ID is going to be a key one all across the board, in which case I'll go ahead and give a max length, and we'll do like, I don't know, 255. I'm not sure if it'd ever get to be that length, but we'll go ahead and do that. I also want to go ahead and say unique is true. A big part of the reason for that is our Clerk user should be unique in Clerk, therefore it should also be unique on our own Django project itself. And so this is also going to be an index, so we'll go ahead and do db index, not comment, but index being true as well, so that it just is a little bit more efficient of a lookup. Now, one of the things I'm not going to do is I'm not going to actually make this our primary key. That is not going to be that. That will still be ID, which is models.bigInt, field, and all that. We're going to leave that in as the primary key itself. I'm not going to customize that part for good reason, which we'll talk about in a second. But the idea here is now we've got this Clerk user ID, and any other field beyond this is just basically optional in my mind. So the username field, optional. The email field, optional. The reason they're optional is because at any time we can actually use the API lookups into the SDK to get that data. We've already seen that data. So we may or may not need to store it on our local machine at all, or our local database at all. Our Django projects database is what I really mean there. So you totally could add a bunch of stuff related to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in those as optional fields, which are going to look like this. So we've got our username field in here. This is now optional, blank being true, null being true. We may or may not want to have the unique constraint here based off of whatever we are doing in Clerk. Like, for example, if we remove username fields or delete one in Clerk and we didn't update our local database, maybe we want that. Email, same thing. Maybe we are making changes on the front end that we're just not synced up yet. So again, I'm going to go ahead and say, get rid of that uniqueness. Now, we have the option to change this as we see fit. In fact, we could actually use this as just a foreign key related model to the user model itself. So if you were going to add this to a pre-existing Django project, the way you would go about doing it is by going in from django.conf. You would import the settings module itself, and then you would come in here and say user equals to settings dot auth user model, and then come down here. You would set user equals to models dot one to one field of the user, and then on delete we would do models dot cascade. Okay, so this would be if you were adding this later. That gives you a single Clerk user ID to the built-in Django user model, which might mean that you have to customize or create your own usernames for that built-in model if you are creating users from Clerk directly. But of course, we're not going to be doing that. That's just something worth mentioning if you were adding this later. If you want to see an in-depth tutorial of me adding like Clerk to a pre-existing project, please let me know in the comments. But the idea here is we are only doing our custom user, so I'm not going to actually bring those things in. I just wanted to mention them so you were aware of it. So what are the other fields? How do we actually configure this otherwise? If you do a quick search on Google for customizing authentication in Django, it will bring you to this documentation page, and you come on down to the full example here. This is the example we're going to work off of. So what I want to do is copy this entire thing, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste it in here just like that. And the main reason for this has to do with our model manager maybe. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that one in above. We may or may not use this model manager, but I'm going to go ahead and paste it above my custom user here. And then I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the actual abstract user is what we're using here. So I'm going to go ahead and replace our models.model with abstract user. We don't need the email field. We might need these fields, I'm not sure. So let's go ahead and have is active and is admin in there as Boolean values. This is probably going to be Django login related, which might not be something we do at all. This right here would be Django admin related, which again might not be anything we end up doing either. Like actually using the Django admin at this point. I think at this point, maybe in the long run we do it, but for now we're not going to. So next up, what we've got here is this username field. This is the key one when it comes to using the abstract base user. This is now going to be our Clerk user ID. So in some respects, the user would have to log in. If they were going to log in with Django directly, they would have to use their Clerk user ID. They wouldn't be able to use a username or email, which is what's going on here. But of course, they're never going to log in that way, or at least how we're going, the way they're going to log in is always on the front end using Clerk itself. That's it. That's how it's going to work from here on out. Required fields, in this case, would just be an empty list because there are no other required fields. And then we've got permissions in here. A lot of this stuff that you would want to add in to the field as well that are related to it. Obviously, we're just going to leave it kind of open-ended on that front. Okay, so now that we've got this, we now have our abstract user model, which is this custom user. So there is this model manager in here that has create user, which we might want to do, or we might want to just change it a little bit. You don't need to create a super user at this point. Maybe you will at some point, but for now, we're just trying to integrate stuff. Adding those more advanced features is outside the scope of this course. But the point here is we've got the custom user model here. I'm going to go ahead and do objects equals to that one. And the idea, of course, is passing in the Clerk ID and then just creating the user from that. So actually, it should be the Clerk user ID like that. And we'll go ahead and call all of these the Clerk user ID. But this is a very straightforward model itself. You could also do something like user is active being true, right? So it's just active in the user database itself. And if it's a specific user, you could make it is admin. But there we go. So now we've got our custom user in here. So all we really need to do is bring it into our Django project. So the way that happens is first off in installed apps, we'll go ahead and do internal apps. We'll go ahead and add in accounts here, save that. And then I'm going to go ahead and run Python manage.py, make migrations. And let's go ahead and make sure we spell it correctly. So Python manage.py, make migrations. So if you weren't aware, anytime you make changes to models.py, you want to run Python manage.py, make migrations, and then Python manage.py, migrate. In my case, it actually created a bunch of new stuff in general. It obviously created accounts, but it also created the standard user stuff in there as well. So the last final piece of this would be to change the user model, our auth user model. Hey, what do you know? I mentioned that before when I was talking about connecting this to this user. We are just overriding that or changing that to accounts dot, accounts of course being our app here, and then the model class name itself, which is going to be accounts dot custom user. We save that, we run migrate again, nothing changes. But of course, if I run Python manage.py create super user, for example, it's going to attempt to create it with that Clerk user ID, which I'm not going to do just yet. And I probably won't do in this series. But the point here is we now have a custom user model that we can start working with. Now, while we're at this, I want to show you the reason you even need a user model and not just the custom user or the Clerk user ID. And it has to do with something related to foreign keys. So if we do Python manage.py start app and posts like user posts, you would come in here and go and grab your models, and we would say post models.model. Let's go ahead and just call it a blog post, for example, or like a tweet or something like that. But the idea is we've got a blog post. You would put in some content here, do models.text field. Maybe you would also add in a timestamp. So let's go ahead and say timestamp being models.date time field, auto now add being true. This I'm actually moving more towards using just created at so that it has a little bit more descriptive name itself, even though timestamp works too. But the idea is we now have this blog post model and we want to associate it to a user, the user that's actually adding this blog post model. So what we would end up doing is we would do from Django.conf, we would import settings, and then we would go ahead and do our user equals to settings.auth user model, like we just saw a moment ago. Then we would come in here and say user equals to models.foreign key, that user, and then on delete being models.cascade, like delete all of their fields. Or you could do something like set null, delete all that if that user model is ever deleted. I'm going to leave it in as simply cascade so that all of the blog posts that user might create is now deleted. So this creates a unique relationship with the user itself. There's a lot of different things about it. There's reverse relationships. So if you have the user model or user object itself, you could do blog post set.all and get all of the things that are related to that particular user. Of course, there's a lot more to it than just that, but a big part of the reason that we are customizing this user and not just using this has to do with these foreign keys, actually correlating and tying these things together on the database level so our queries are far more efficient and effective, but also whenever we need to delete a user, it will delete all of their other stuff as well. Now, the other part about this has to do with Django itself. If we ever wanted to move away from any sort of user itself or move towards something else, we totally could do that and still have all of that data available to us, right? So it kind of gives us a lot of flexibility all around how we actually associate data in our Django project to other users. Now, this same process would be very similar in other web frameworks. So if you were using like SQL model with FastAPI, you would still do something very similar to this. It would just be technically written a little bit differently, but functionally it would be basically the same thing, where you'd still have a overarching user model that then gets foreign key related to other models that that user would own the data to. But now that we have a custom user model and we can see that we can now associate a bunch of data to that particular user, of course, we want to build those features out. But before we do, let's go ahead and actually get the user for any given Clerk user ID and store that in the database. Let's take a look. We're now going to create a helper function that will either update our Django user with our Clerk user data, or it will create the user in our Django database for all of the things. So the idea here is we're going to jump into our SRC here. I'm going to create a new module called helpers, and then we'll just go ahead and do init.py. So in these helpers, I'm going to go ahead and create another one called myClerk.py. The reason I'm calling it myClerk is just in case that if any point Clerk decided to change the name of their Python package, I don't have any issues with it. So myClerk is what it's going to be called. So the first thing I want to do in here actually goes back into our API.py and bringing this on over, this request stuff over. So I'm going to go ahead and copy everything above it and we'll paste that in there. I don't think I'll need everything in here. I'll just bring in a few of those things like that and that. So what we've got here is our settings for that. Our warnings are in there. The other imports we no longer need. So now that I've got this in here, I'm just going to go back into my API and I'll go ahead and do from helpers import myClerk, and then now I'll use myClerk dot get the user ID from request, which of course will grab that same function that we had before. So now I can get rid of all of the other ones inside of here as well, with maybe the exception of this right here, which of course we will look at as well. So realistically, I don't actually want the user in here. This hello world API view, I probably won't want that user in there either. Let's just go ahead and keep it for the moment though. And I'll just put it in right here and just reorganize things a little bit so we can still actually grab that user data for the moment. Okay, so the idea is I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing and we'll go back into myClerk here and I'm going to go ahead and create a new function that we're going to go ahead and call something like update or create Clerk user. And this time it's going to take in the Clerk user ID, which will allow for me to do a number of things related to it. But of course, it's really just these three lines right here, roughly speaking. So let's go ahead and import JSON here. And we'll go ahead and get rid of a few items in here. If there is no Clerk ID, then we would probably want to return back none probably. So I'll go ahead and do that. If, not Clerk user ID, then we'll go ahead and return back none, as in no user. All right. The same thing would be true if we do this lookup here, and we would say if not that, we would also say none, and we're getting close. Okay, so the next part is we've got this Clerk JSON. So what we actually don't really want to have is JSON data. This is too vague of data for us to really make sense out of it on how we're going to store it. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say my new Django user data is going to be equal to a few fields in here. Now you could go through all of the fields as you see fit, but I'm going to go ahead and grab, hey, what do you know? I'm grabbing the username field because we can add that if we wanted to. So we can do clerkuser.username just like that. I can also do the first name field in here, which is clerk and user dot first name. And we can kind of repeat this process for as many fields as we really need. In this case, I'm just going to have a few of them because we don't really need that much data stored into our Django project. Now, I still want the email, but I'm not going to do that just yet. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in from Django a little bit of another thing, which is from Django.contrib.auth. We're going to import the get user model function here. And then right underneath our secret key, we'll go ahead and declare the get user model function here. Now, for those of you who know Django really well, hopefully understand this will actually get this model right here, the custom user model based off of our settings that are set right here. So if you weren't using the custom user model, then you would want to import the actual model that you're using itself. But now, since we have our custom user model, this will grab that user and I can actually update that user based off of some of this data. So how is it that I want to update it? Well, I'm going to go ahead and grab the user object and create it. And what we're going to do is user objects dot update. This is update or create here. And we're going to pass in the field that is going to be permanently the same, as in it's never going to change. That is our clerk user ID. So we'll pass that in as always the same value. And then everything else that we would want to change would be the defaults. These are the fields that will be updated. Any fields that you declare specifically will not be updated. They will be part of the create function in here. This is very similar to like get or create, but in this case, it's going to go ahead and update the defaults in there. And in which case we would return back those values. So the user object and whether or not it is created. So this will give us that actual user data that we're storing into our database. But we're missing one key thing, and that is going to be our email itself. So what is going to be our user email, right? So I'm going to go ahead and grab this and we'll put it in here just like this. Now, what I actually want this to be is the primary email that Clerk has in place. So if we actually take a look at the SDK, so if we go back into the API here and we print out something related to it, we could also just print out the JSON or even probably look at the front end at this point. Go ahead and hit trigger backend. We inspect the element here. What happens is you'll see the data that's coming through is we've got an email address that has an array. It has a bunch of items in there. And then we also have, if we scroll down a little bit more, we see that we've got a primary email address ID. This ID is associated to one of the emails that's in here. So we just need to loop through them to find the correct one in there so that we can actually store it into our database itself. So it doesn't give you the primary email address itself, it just gives you this ID that you can then look through in here. Now, granted, we could also store all of this data into our database as well, but in our case, we really just want to extract this value right here. So the way we go about doing that is going back into my clerk.py. I'm going to go ahead and grab, first off, the primary email ID, and this is going to be our clerk user dot. And once again, we look in here, we can see that it is the primary email address ID, which I'll go ahead and name it the same thing. So there we go. So that should give us that value. And basically what I'll say here is I'm going to start off with the default being none. And then we'll just say if there is a primary email address ID, then we're going to go ahead and grab those email addresses. So the email addresses then are going to be, we'll go ahead and just call them our clerk email addresses. And this is going to be equal to our clerk user dot, well, let's go back and take a look at the data itself. There it is, email addresses. This is a list of dictionaries in here. So one of the ways on how we can actually go about grabbing this would be by iterating through. So the long form way would be something like for email data in email addresses. Then we would basically say the email, let's go ahead and do underscore ID, or let's go do underscore email ID equals to email data.get ID. And then we basically say if the email ID is equal to the primary email address ID, then we would go ahead and say the primary email is equal to the email address that's in there. So that would be the email data.get, that email address. And so we're just looping through everything, looking for that. And then if we do find it, we will go ahead and break that loop if it's in there. Great. And so another way to write this actually would be to just use a next function. So we can just come in here and paste it in. And this does the same thing. So it loops through all of the email addresses for our clerk user. And then if the email.id is equal to that primary email address that we had in here, which should be that one right there, then it will return back that email. Otherwise, it will return back none. So this is kind of a clean way to do these several lines. So that's why I'm going to leave it like that. Okay, so with this in mind now, we have a primary email that we're passing in with our user. So of course, the question is, where do we actually grab this or where do we use it? Well, in the long run, we'll put it into middleware, but for now, we'll go ahead and put it into this Hello World API here, which will allow me to call it. So we've got our clerk user in here. Now I can actually go ahead and grab my user equals to my clerk dot, update or create the clerk user based off of that user ID now. And in this case now, we would return back some data in here. This I'll just go ahead and say first name is equal to user.first name, and then maybe user, or let's say ID, and we'll pass in user.id. In the long run, I probably wouldn't actually return that data specifically in this case, but we definitely can. So let's actually just see what that looks like. Now that we've got everything going, let's just make sure that our server's still running. Looks like it is. One of the things I realized also is I don't know if I synced the database with the posts, so I'll go ahead and bring that in as well. So we'll go ahead and just say posts here, and then we'll do python manage.py, and we'll run our make migrations, and then python manage.py migrate, and there we go. And of course, this is using db.sqlite3, which of course we could change later. But at this point, let's go ahead and see if it actually creates the user. I'm going to go ahead and hit trigger backend, and we get an error of some kind. So let's go ahead and see what the error is. We get this user.firstname. Oh yeah, I see why. Okay, so the reason why is if we go back into my clerk here and we see this update or create, it's actually sending back the user object and whether or not it was created or updated. So if this is true, that means it was created. If it's false, that means it was updated. If there's an error, that means there was an error, of course. Okay, so this should say user and maybe underscore, or you could even put created there, which I'll go ahead and just do. We'll put created and we'll pass that in as part of the response in here itself. I'll go ahead and save it. At this point, it won't be created because it should already be in the database. So let me refresh in here. I'll trigger that back end. There we go. First name, Justin, ID 1, created. Fantastic. So of course, the challenge here would be if we went into the clerk dashboard and we went ahead and deleted this user, our Django project wouldn't necessarily know about that. So one of the things you would want to do to advance that in the future would be to implement webhooks. This is outside the scope of this course itself, but you would implement a webhook and you would use a lot of these same features inside of that webhook to get that user and then maybe delete them or update them. There's other ways on how you could go about updating a specific user. But of course, now that we have this user in here, what we want is we want to be able to leverage request.user anywhere on our Django project, whether it's an API request or it's a front-end request otherwise. So that's the key part as to what we want to do next. And that's kind of going to wrap up a lot of things related to Django itself. And of course, at this point, you would probably want to remove a lot of the imports you're no longer working with. So having that helper function also cleans up our views themselves. They're going to be a lot more clean, and they're going to be even more clean once we do the next step with the middleware. So in every API request we make with Clerk, I want to be able to access the request user. I want to be able to say print request user and it be the same object as this user right here if the Clerk is actually authenticated. So the way we're going to do this is jumping into helpers here. I'm going to turn my Clerk into a module itself. So we'll go ahead and do my Clerk and then a slash and then init.py just like that. And then our old one we'll just drag on over. We'll move it in there just like that. This one I'll call services or maybe utils. Let's just go ahead and name it utils.py. There we go. And then in my init method here, I'll go ahead and import these things so all of my imports are still working correctly. So from .utils, we'll go ahead and import the get clerk ID and then also this right here. And then we'll go ahead and do all equaling to those two items as strings, so that it's a valid module like that. Okay, so if we save it, everything should still be working correctly. Let's go ahead and just run trigger here and it looks like everything comes back. Okay, great. So now I'm gonna go ahead inside of my Clerk, I'm gonna go ahead and create middleware.py. And I'm going to create some Clerk Auth middleware. And this is just a simple class that we can define an init method in here. And it takes in self and get response. That's the default that comes in to Clerk middleware, or middleware in Django, I should say. And then we just do self.get response equals to the argument that comes through with that get response. Then we create a override to the call method here, which takes in self and request, and then returns self.get response of that request. Okay, so this is how this would be something like this, actually, if we wanted to really think through what's happening here. This is before views, this is before views return response, right? So if we think of our view in here, this is an API view, but still a view nonetheless, that middleware will happen above here and then right before we respond back. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here. And in my case, I don't need to do anything after the response. I need to do it before the request comes through, basically. So that's what we're going to do right here. And what is it that we want to grab? Well, we want to grab the user itself, which I'll just say user is none. And then we'll basically say if user, then we'll go ahead and do request.user equals to that user. And then the question, of course, then becomes, how do we get that user? What do you know? We already have some utility functions for this. So I'm going to use these utility functions, but I'm going to go ahead and change it a little bit so that in the future, if I need to cache things and make it a more efficient request, I would do something like Django user session via clerk, and this will take in the request and it's going to return back our Django user in here. So basically, in other words, I'll go ahead and do from helpers.myclerk.utils. We're going to go ahead and import the two functions that we want, which was that get clerk ID from request and then update or create clerk user. So the very first one being our clerk user ID being equal to that same request. So of course, this is going to be a lot like the view. And we would say, if not, clerk user ID will return back none, just to kind of hedge it a little bit. And then the next one, of course, being our Django user, and then underscore equaling to the update or create clerk user based off of that clerk ID. And then we would return back that user as well. So if we didn't do this or none part here, we actually want to double check inside of our update or create clerk user to make sure it's working correctly. So in here, I see that it says, if not, it just returns none when we actually have two things coming back at the very end. So I want to make sure that I do that on both of these. So false here and false here, or none, basically. Actually, it shouldn't be created. It should just be none, none, because we've got user and created. Okay, so of course we could add types and all that if we wanted to, but now that we've got this actual middleware here, of course, now I just need to call that middleware in here with that request coming through. So what you would probably want to do in the long run is to cache a lot of things related to this. The only reason I'm not doing that is for simplicity and to not really build out a whole, middleware thing that we would really want to build out. Most of this is about proof of concept here. So what we would end up doing is we now have this middleware that we want to map in. So inside of settings.py, we're going to go into middleware here, and we're going to go ahead and do helpers.myclerk.middleware. And then the name of the class in there, just like that. Great. So now in our API, this user data in here should in theory be our actual request user. So I'm going to go ahead and now say user equals to request.user. I'm no longer going to have this created in here whatsoever. But what I will do is instead of saying clerk ID, I will go ahead and get rid of these, and we'll go ahead and say if not request.user.is authenticated, then we'll go ahead and return back the JSON response, and it will be detail and say something like login required in here, login required, and then we'll just go ahead and add in the status argument. I always forget if it's status code or just simply status. If I remember correctly, I think it's status. So we'll go ahead and do status here. And then this should absolutely work for us now. So let's go ahead and save everything. Let's make sure our middleware is working, settings are saved, and inside of Docker, it looks like everything's working in there. So let's go ahead and give this another shot. We'll trigger our backend here. And if we did everything correct, we should get that data back. Sure enough, we do. And the print statement should also come back if we had any print statements in our API. So like printing out the request user in here, which would be our Django user, of course. I hit trigger backend and we save it again, the file, just to fill that out. And there is that request user. And now we have the ability to just dramatically expand all of the API endpoints that we might want to build. Now, do keep in mind, I'm not using third-party API packages whatsoever. You definitely still could, but in this case, we're doing pretty simple things. We don't necessarily need to build out something like using Django REST Framework or Django Ninja. We can actually just use Django together. And there is still one more thing that I might want to add in something like this. But before I do, let's just verify the is authenticated part. I'm going to come in here and log out, trigger backend, and now I'm getting this error in here, right? So I got a server error that's coming through about this backend. And this has to do with just some little things that need to be tweaked a little bit. So we've got get clerk user ID from request. So inside of our utility functions, we need to now go through these to make sure they're working correctly. And they're not, because it's trying to grab the payload when there is none. Because of the request itself, the user's not authenticated. So I just want to move this up a little bit to that right there. So that is actually closer to what the docs say themselves. And so now that I've got that, let's go ahead and try it again. I'm going to refresh in here and hit trigger backend, and I get this login required, right? And so that really just solves that one single problem. But the main thing here is it's now saying, hey, login required. So let's go ahead and log in, and then we would actually be able to do that same exact request using Clerk now, using the Clerk authentication completely. And now I can trigger it again. And what do you know? There it is, working pretty well. So realistically, at the next point is to just verify that I don't need to have all of these. Like, I want to have a login required decorator that works based off of my little custom API stuff that we're doing right here. Let's take a look. Django has a built-in decorator called login required, which is in Django.contrib.auth.decorators. We can import the login required decorator, and we can do something like this where we put in the login required. And of course, this works just fine when we actually have the middleware going. And let's just double check in our inspect element here. We see the console, there's that data coming back, and it works just fine. But if I were to log out, it works sort of, but not exactly what we want. So if I hit trigger backend here, I get this invalid page, this HTML page coming back, but I do get the status code of 404. So in some respects, it is working correctly, but I actually want to make that a little bit better. I want to improve this for the request I'm doing here. The way we're going to do that is jump into my Clerk again, and I'm going to go ahead and do decorators.py, and we're going to define our own decorator. So this is going to take in a couple things. First off, we want to go ahead and grab the JSON response, because that's how we're going to respond to all the different decorator functions themselves, is with JSON data. And we're going to go ahead and bring in from func tools, we're going to import wraps, and then we're going to define our decorator here, which is going to be our API login required, which will take in a view function. This is, of course, how a decorator works, and then it's going to return back something else. Now, the way this works is we do @wraps, the view function itself, and then we define what we want to happen before that view function is used, really. So we're going to go ahead and call this our wrapped view, and this will take in a request, args, and keyword args, and then we'll return something related to the view function itself, which would just be grabbing that view function and passing in the request, args, and keyword args. Okay, and so we want to return back that wrapped view just like that. Okay, so this is actually this is like the baseline level of how you can make your own custom decorator for any of the views themselves. It's looking for the request, because every API view or view in Django uses requests. That's a key defining characteristic of those requests. Every once in a while, you might have keyword arguments in here, like post ID being a number or something like that. But in this case, this will actually cover all of those. And so the idea here is really just to check if not request.user.is authenticated, then we would return back a JSON response and have some sort of detail in here saying auth required, and then passing in a status code in here. We could do 401, I think is a better one than 400 400 is more about permissions anyway. So there we go. We've got our auth required now. And so now that we've got this, it's really simple. We just go back into that API view here, and then we just import that in. So what I could do is I can just leave it in my clerk. So I'm actually going to go ahead and do that. So inside of my clerk and the init method here, we're going to go ahead and import the method of login required here, so that then in my API, instead of using login required, I would do my clerk dot login required. We'll verify this in just a moment. And then we should be able to actually do that login stuff without this right here. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it now, save that. And then let's go ahead and refresh in here, sign in, or actually we probably should go back, refresh, hit trigger backend, which is now saying unauthorized, auth required. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and log in, make sure that that part's still working in here as well. And here we go. Trigger backend, and now it works. Great. So what initially was quite a big API view, we now have a much more narrow view altogether, and it really just requires these few things in here to make it all work. So yes, you absolutely could modify some of these things to work with a more dedicated Django API framework, like the Django REST framework, like Django Ninja. But overall, I think this is very straightforward on how we can move going forward as well. So really the question then going forward would be, how do we actually handle like when we need to log in and all that, right? That would be all front end stuff. So if the person's not logged in, how would we force them to log in, if you will? And that would require us to move to probably something different than just pure old React, which is exactly what we want to do. We want to actually move into something new so that not only can we handle login, but if I go into / like posts and create, it will actually show a completely different view here that I would be able to submit data and then build out some sort of backend for my API posts, which of course we are going to take a look at. It's very straightforward going forward at this point. We have so many things now worked out in terms of Django itself that the connection is just going to be pretty seamless going forward. It's just a matter of building out the correct apps. Now, one thing that I will still do is I will still build out a FastAPI application so you can see how we might be able to use all of these things together, at least at a high level, along with a Next.js application as well. Let's go ahead and build out a minimal FastAPI application that integrates with Clerk. And of course, it's still going to be using our React front end that will trigger the backend call for this. So the way we're going to do this is very similar to how we started our Django project. So I'll come in here and do FastAPI Clerk, and then we're going to go ahead and copy the Dockerfile and requirements file into FastAPI itself. And it's going to be almost the same thing. The command is going to be a little bit different in here. Instead of being Python, it's going to be something different. So before I jump into the command, let's go ahead and jump into the requirements here. First off, it's going to be FastAPI and then UVicorn. Now, optionally, you might use something like SQL Model if you want to store database data, which I do recommend if you are going to be using FastAPI to use SQL Model. And then if you want to see time series model data, I have a package called TimescaleDB that works with that database itself. But the idea here is we want to look at a minimum one with just simply FastAPI. And so in our Dockerfile, as you might recall, we've got SRC going into the app, so I need to bring in that folder as well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Next up, we run our installations. All of that works just fine. Then we use UVicorn in here. The reason I use UVicorn instead of some other things that FastAPI has is this is more production ready. We're getting closer to doing the production one in using UVicorn. Next up, what we declare is the actual Python module we're going to use, which is going to be main and then app. So that means inside of SRC here, I want to create main.py, and then I'm going to go ahead and declare an app, which is going to be equal to a FastAPI app like that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in from FastAPI, we're going to import the FastAPI app or the FastAPI class just like that. And so this app right here, we're going to use on our command. So UVicorn main:\app. FastAPI doesn't have a scaffolding thing similar to Django or even Vite. But the idea here is we've got UVicorn main:\app. Then we need to do some of the same things we did with Django, which was binding the host itself. So we're going to go ahead and do host, comma, and then that's going to be all of those zeros again. And then the next step would be doing our port value, which we would do comma and then dash dash port like that. And then the final step here would be dash dash reload. And in this case, I'm going to change the port value to, let's say, 8002. So this command is just really separated out as to what you might do on your local command line, which would look something like this, right? And so I'm basically doing that same thing as a little list or array here. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and build out our FastAPI application itself before we implement Docker Compose in there. So the idea is overall, we want to create our FastAPI app and we want to make it within the request. So we want to bring in the request itself. So what I do here is I define a decorator called app.the HTTP method we want to support, which I'll just do /. So app as in the FastAPI application, the HTTP method of get, and then the route of just simply / or the index route. And this is going to be just something like read root or read index. Then it takes in the request as a default, and then it's going to return back something like hello world, right? Cool. So before we go much further here, we see that the request is in here. That is something we want to use. Now, going back into Django, we have our helpers in here, my clerk, utils, and I've got this get clerk user ID from the request, which handles all of this stuff. Hey, that looks very familiar. Can I copy this and use it in FastAPI? Let's give it a try. So I'm gonna go ahead and paste this in here. Then of course, I'm gonna go ahead and grab, I'll call this my clerk user ID, assuming that everything went well within the request. Now, of course, I need those imports as well. So jumping back into Django, I'm gonna go ahead and grab those imports in there also, just to make sure that all of that's working. So once again, we see these authorized parties in here. So whenever I see something like that, it makes me think, oh, maybe I should also bring in something from FastAPI. I'm gonna put this down below here. I'm gonna go ahead and bring in our actual, cores middleware in FastAPI. So it's fastapi.middleware.cores. We're gonna import the cores middleware here. And I'm gonna go ahead and define this. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and copy and paste it. This is coming, I think, directly from their documentation, but we use that cores middleware class and then just gonna allow everything. Normally, you would probably wanna specify the specific hosts like we did in Django, but I'm gonna go ahead and allow everything. So the next step would be getting the clerk secret key itself, which I'm gonna go ahead and just grab from OS. And this is gonna be clerk secret key os.environ.get, the clerk secret key, just like that. So if all goes well, what we will see is hello world and then our clerk ID, just like that. So I think this should be just fine. This should actually handle everything we need to for FastAPI on this absolute minimum example. Naturally, the actual Dockerfile itself, we need to obviously keep track of the port that we're using here. But overall, let's go ahead and now build it out in compose.yaml. I'm going to copy the Django stuff once again and just change it a little bit, and we'll call it our FastAPI application. And of course, this is going to be in now FastAPI and clerk. So basically the same otherwise, which I'm going to go ahead and use just like that. The ports, we did 8002, which I'll do the same port on my local host as well as the actual container itself. Just double check it in there. There it is. Requirements, everything's all saved up. Okay, great. So I'm gonna go ahead and try this out. Notice that I'm still using the same env file as well. So let's go ahead and do our Docker compose down, and then I'll go back into the original one that we had running somewhere in here. And we'll go ahead and do Docker and Docker compose up -- watch, hit enter, and hopefully this builds it out. It looks like it's building out that context now for our FastAPI application that will be running in here. So next thing is, of course, going into React Clerk here, I'm gonna go into my app.jsx, and I'm gonna go ahead and copy the original backend request. And now I'm gonna go ahead and say something like, send handle send user data to the FastAPI backend, or let's just go ahead and call this something like call FastAPI backend, just so it's not too confusing with the other one. But this time it's going to be 8002, and it's not going to have any path. It's just going to be the root there. So it should go to that right there. And now with my buttons here, I'm going to go ahead and call, we'll just go ahead and say call FastAPI backend, and I'll just put it into a div here. And then I'll get rid of these images. I'm not sure why I kept them, but let's go ahead and get rid of those now. And let's see if our Docker application is up and running. Looks like it is. We've got a React app in here, our FastAPI app in here. Looks like it's also running. So let's give this a shot inside of our Vite application here. We've got trigger backend. I'm going to go ahead and inspect the element for our Django project. Sure enough, there it is. Let's call FastAPI, which I said fall FastAPI, which I can't tell if it actually did call it or not because, well, we didn't actually call the function. So let's go ahead and try that again and call, not fall FastAPI. And this is going to be trigger Django backend, or maybe call Django backend now. Save that, and we'll go ahead and refresh in here. Call FastAPI, hello world. There is our Clerk ID. This is incredible if you ask me. What I'm going to do with those response data, I'm going to go ahead and come in here and say, just like, data and set data. I'm going to go ahead and do use state, and I'm going to go ahead and use that data. So we'll go ahead and set it here. Actually, let's go ahead and do display data and then set display data. And that way we can actually see it a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and set this in a number of places here, just so we know exactly what's going on with these responses in here. There we go. And then I'll go ahead and grab that display data. We'll bring it right underneath the H1 maybe, put a div in here, and then do, and that display data JSON.stringify of that data. Let's take a look here. I'm going to go ahead and call my Django backend. There's my Django backend. There's my FastAPI front end. Boom, 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 boom. Going back and forth as to what it is that I'm calling. This is amazing to me. This is like so much easier because now my FastAPI backend, if I want it to be a microservice, for example, the best example of this would be a series I just finished, which was tracking YouTube video playback on a project. So basically you would embed the YouTube video and it would track all that with that FastAPI backend, which now works, and it can work with this user ID. And it's really simple as far as the change concern in the front end. It would just be a matter of enriching that app or the request itself with the token itself, which is this right here. This is so cool. It's like hard to overstate how amazing this is because it's just now allowing me to use so many more backends. And of course, correlating the data can be something that happens later. So if you were to use the FastAPI backend with a database itself, so coming back in here, if we were to store some data into a SQL database, whether it's Postgres or otherwise, we would probably have to have another worker process to help coordinate that data with all of the different databases you might be using with that particular user ID. But the thing is, as long as we're tracking that user ID and we're storing it correctly and it's coming from Clerk, bringing all that data back into one place is going to be very straightforward to do. We're now going to bring Next.js into our project with, of course, Docker Compose. Now, the way this is going to work is very similar to our React app. So we're going to come in here and I'll just go ahead and give it a Next.js app, and it's going to be the image of Node.js. Then we want to go ahead and bring in some volumes here, and the volume itself is going to be the entire folder, so we can actually build out the Next.js app, similar to like what we did with Vite, of course. Then after that, we're going to go ahead and do our working directory, which is going to be /app as well. Great. So that should be all we need to do at this point. Soon we'll do all of basically the same things we did with React app. So let's go ahead and run our Docker Compose. We'll go ahead and bring everything down first with our remove orphans. Go ahead and hit enter if it's not already down. Now we're going to go ahead and do Docker Compose run our Next.js app with bin/bash. Open that up and we should see all of our projects in here. Now, the command we're going to use is npx create next app at latest. So basically we want to make sure that npx is available inside of this container. which does come with Node.js by itself. So go ahead and copy this and paste it in. Now I will say Next.js does change a lot more than Vite and React does. So there's certain things about this that might change in the near future too, but I'm gonna go ahead and run this and we want to install everything. We'll go ahead and say yes. And then what is the name of our project? I'm gonna call it Next.js-Clerk to match with everything else. I'm not gonna be using TypeScript or ESLint. I will use Tailwind. I will use the SRC directory, app router, TurboPack, and then we're gonna go ahead and not import the alias. Now, there's a lot of other defaults you might consider using as well, but those were the main ones that I wanted to make sure I was using in my project. Okay, so naturally it builds out that folder like we've seen before. So at this point, I'm gonna exit again, and I'm gonna go ahead and clear out and then run remove orphans to make sure that that doesn't build again. So there's a couple of things that I wanna do. The first one is changing Next.js-Clerk to Next.js_Clerk. I'm not gonna update any imports. There shouldn't be any imports to update anyway. But the next thing is I'm gonna go ahead and copy the Dockerfile. I'm gonna bring that into Next.js-Clerk. I'm also gonna go ahead and copy the Docker ignore file into there as well. And I'm gonna go ahead and delete these node modules in here just like that. Great. So now we look inside of our Dockerfile here. One of the things we can get rid of is these last two portions that we no longer need. I'm gonna go ahead and just keep those out all together so that we can just run npm run dev like that. Great. So the next thing is then, of course, back into compose.yaml. I'm not gonna use this image anymore, so I'll go ahead and get rid of it. My build command I will still use. It's gonna be very similar, of course. This time it's gonna be our Next.js and Clerk, right? The volumes are gonna be all of the files that we wanna for sure bring over. So it's gonna be kind of a lot. It's gonna be a little tedious. So first off is gonna be SRC here. We wanna bring that over into app SRC. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that and also do the same thing with public. And I'm really just trying to put this in the same order that we see over here. We don't need the git ignore or the docker ignore. JS config would be the next one. So we're gonna go ahead and copy that and we'll do JS config.json like that. And then you're gonna go each one going forward just to get them all filled out, which I will just go ahead and copy and paste some of them because I already did it. And there we go. So we got package.json in there. That one's key, JSON config. You just basically want to make sure you're grabbing the files that you're actually going to use. Yours might be different depending on your configuration when you first created it, but you want to get all of those files in there as best you can. Great. So now that we've got the volumes in here, the next portion, of course, is going to be our env file that we will bring in. So I'll go ahead and bring that in. The ports that we're going to use. Now, by default, the port for Next.js is going to run at port 3000 during development mode. So we're going to leave it as that. We're also going to add in two environment variables here, the node environment being development, and then the host in there being 000. We could actually put the node environment into our React app as well. So this could be a really good location to move into .env potentially, or maybe both of them. But I definitely want to have it now because we're using our Next.js app. Next up, we want to do the same sort of develop command. I'm going to go ahead and copy that and we'll bring this up. In this case, I'm going to make it simple and literally just track if the Dockerfile changes or the package changes, and that's it. So we'll go ahead and save that as is. There we go. So at this point, I should be able to build this app. So I'm going to call it specifically to build it. So I'll do docker compose build the Next.js app. Of course, the name of it right there. We're going to go ahead and hit enter, let that build out just to make sure that it ends up working. From what I've done, the actual Next.js app itself, I've had issues with this just working in Docker, which is why we're taking a little bit longer on this one than we would have otherwise, because you would think it'd be a lot like just using the React one, but it's a little bit different. Not that much, but enough to warrant a dedicated portion of this. So we're going to now do docker compose up of that Next.js app. We're going to still use watch in here, so I'll go ahead and do that. You could also do build again if you really wanted to build it, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave it in as watch. And what it should have is exactly this. So it should 100% now run, and where I can open it up on my local machine. Notice the port in there at port 3000. So that is looking pretty good. So now that we've got our Next.js app up and running, it's time to actually bring in our Clerk stuff. Let's now integrate Clerk into our Next.js application. The very first step I'm going to do is go into Configure here, scroll on down to the API keys, and then I'm going to navigate over to Next.js. So what you're going to want to have, of course, is a actual .env file with these two keys in here. When it comes to Next.js, it can actually handle both a public key and a private key because Next.js does have a backend runtime that you could use. We aren't going to be using it, but you definitely could use it. Now, the nice thing about using Next.js with Clerk is we don't need to use the backend runtime of Next.js at all to forward requests and enrich sessions with auth tokens. We don't need to do it. Clerk handles that for us. So that's actually a really cool part of all of this, which is something that maybe you didn't realize. But now that we've got this, let's go ahead and grab the data here. I'm going to jump into my cursor app and I'm going to go ahead and paste it into env Next.js local so that I can actually use that one now. So in Next.js app, I'm going to change this to env Next.js and local. There we go. Okay, so with this in mind, I'm going to now go ahead and do docker compose run Next.js app bin/bash, and then we'll go ahead and go through the documentation for Next.js. Now, there's a lot of different ways on how you can get there. One of the easiest ways, of course, would be going into Clerk's docs and then selecting your SDK, whatever you might be using. And then in our case, we're going to be using App Router. So go ahead and do that quick start, especially now that we have our environment variables in place. So of course, we already have an Next.js application. All we need to do is install Clerk into it. So I'll go ahead and copy this, run it inside of our container for Next.js. And then I'll go to the next part, which is adding Clerk middleware to your app. So in this case, it says middleware.ts, and we want to put it inside of the root of the src directory. So we'll go ahead and copy middleware.ts. We'll go into src here, just make sure it's underlined, hit new file, add that in, and then I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste in here. Now, we aren't using TypeScript for this project, so we might want to adjust this a little bit to maybe using .js potentially. That may or may not have any impact, but the idea here with Clerk middleware is we can specify which routes in Next.js we want to use to require login to keep going. We'll look at that in just a little bit. So a login required route, if you will, and also login that's not required. So the middleware is a key part of that, granting user authentication state throughout your app. That's what we're talking about. Next up, what we're going to do is add in the provider into layout.jsx. So the way it's going to work is we add the provider around the HTML. Myself, I typically do it around children in the layout, but I'm going to copy their documentation and just go off of that. It actually probably doesn't make a difference, technically speaking. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this in terms of layout.jsx. But of course, ours is layout.js. So we'll go ahead and import this stuff near the top. And then I'll just go ahead and add in the Clerk provider around the HTML. So when I said it doesn't really matter too much, technically speaking, is because we really just need to make sure it's around the children element for this root layout. Hopefully you know this, but if you don't, everything under this layout will adapt from it. So if you see page.js, this home gets injected into where this children is for this root layout. And you can do that on a route basis as well. There's a lot of cool things about Next.js that we're not going to cover right now, but the point here is we need to make sure that we've got that provider in there. So if you see in the documentation, you can also see that they have this header in here for signing in and signing out. We want to have something similar, but we're actually going to make a somewhat functional app so that we want to actually create a nav bar. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and do components, and then inside of components, I'm going to create navbar.jsx. And then I'll go ahead and do my export default, and we're going to do a function called navbar, and it's going to go ahead and return back something. What is it going to return? Hopefully you have a sense as to what it's going to return, and that is, of course, going to be this stuff right here, just so that we can use it really easily and simply in other places. Now, of course, I still need to bring in those imports, so let's go ahead and grab those again, and we'll paste them in here. There we go. I don't need the Clerk provider this time. Now I'll go ahead and grab the nav bar, and I'll go back into my layout here, and inside of the Clerk provider above the children, I'm going to go ahead and add in nav bar here just like that. that will allow for this to work. And of course, it should have imported it, and sure enough, it did, using the @ symbol for us and everything. That's pretty cool. Okay, so now that we've got this, I should be able to test it out. So let's exit out of our container here, and then we'll go ahead and do our Docker compose, and we'll do up Next.js app, and just that for now. We do have orphans, so we'll probably want to take those down soon. But of course, we can open up the localhost at 3000, and what we should see is our logged in. So I actually did test this already, which is why I was already logged in. But let's go ahead and log in again, and we will be able to see this auth flow in Next.js. So the cool thing about what we can do with Next.js is we can customize this auth flow a little bit more. So it's not necessarily just right here as this dropdown. Now, in the case of Vite, you could do that as well. But in our case, in terms of our Next.js application, it makes a whole lot more sense to have a login page, a sign up page, especially when we get into the login required, where we'll have them redirect to that login page and whatnot. Let's now do a login required page. This, of course, is going to go through the middleware that will do the check for us. So what we want to do is we're going to open up our app here. I'm going to go ahead and create dashboard/page.jsx. And then I'm just going to go ahead and export a default function called the dashboard page. And then we're going to go ahead and return back. We'll just return back an H1 for now. So like not ha, but H1. And then we'll go ahead and do welcome to the dashboard, something like that. Okay, so once we do that, we can navigate into dashboard itself. This, of course, is the magic of App Router. It's really just that simple. You select what route you want the page to be on, and you can now see it. So we can take this further. I'm going to go ahead and copy dashboard and put it inside of itself, basically. And we're going to go ahead and rename this to like contact, right? So if we wanted a specific contact page, we would, inside of the dashboard itself, we could do something like this. So I'll go ahead and dashboard contact page. I'm probably not going to use that long term, but it will help us understand how these login required routes work. So if I go into dashboard/contact, we can see that. Okay, so jumping back into our middleware here, this is where we're going to go ahead and import a new part of this called the create route matcher. And what we want to do is we want to declare the routes we want to protect. So I can go ahead and say something kind of like this, where it's like login required routes, and then I can pass in an array of routes that we want to use, starting with a slash. So we're going to go ahead and do dashboard in here, and then I'll go ahead and do my const is protected route, which equals to create route matcher of those login required routes. Okay, so we're close, but now we need to use this is protected route inside of the Clerk middleware. The way we do that is by adding in a callback function in here. And this is going to be an asynchronous callback function, which takes in the auth itself and the request itself. And then we're going to go ahead and return back something or nothing at all. So if I do nothing, it will do nothing, right? So this is kind of the default setup itself. Very similar to like what we did with Django's middleware, where it's like before and after the request. This is basically the same sort of concept. So what we want to do here is then we can check if it's a protected route. We just pass in the request object to this route matcher itself. And if it is a protected route, we will do something like this, where it's auth.protect. That's it. So basically, if it matches one of these paths in here, then we will protect it. So if I refresh in here now onto the dashboard, it quite literally requires me to log in. So let's go ahead and go into localhost 3000. And then if I go into dashboard, it's going to require me to log in here. Okay, cool. Now, of course, if I go back, let's go into dashboard and then contact, we can see that still works. So it's not a wildcard, as in it's not going to connect every other route thereafter dashboard as this default. So if I wanted to also include contact, I could manually do it like this, where then it would include that route. Or I can do a wildcard catcher, which is dot the parentheses dot and then a star. And that should catch everything after that. And of course, this is from the documentation itself. So if I refresh in here, that all works just fine. So of course, now we have a way to protect different routes that we want login required for. Now, you might use dashboard, you might not. The point here is you want to be specific about these routes, and you probably don't want to put stuff like login in there or sign in or enroll, right? Those sorts of routes you probably don't want to have login required on here. But the nice thing about this is then we can see all of the routes in one place that would have this sort of login required in there. And that's what it means by a protected route. Now, if you look in the documentation for the middleware, you will also see stuff like additional protection that you might want to have in there related to a user. So like permission stuff, for example. These are things that you could absolutely build on top of. And you could, I believe, also call your Django project to see different permissions in there for the user as well. But that's a little bit more advanced than what we're doing here. The main thing is just to make sure our users are logged in. And if they're not, make them log in. Now the question is, how can we improve the login flow itself? Do we want to keep it in where it just goes directly to Clerk, or do we want a page that's embedded on our project itself? I bet you can guess where we're going. Into the Clerk documentation, if you scroll on down here, you'll see this add custom sign in or sign up page. We're going to go ahead and build these things out. It's very straightforward. I'm just going to change the routes a little bit. So to make this happen, the first thing that I actually want to do in here is I'm going to go ahead and navigate into my project, Next.js Clerk, and I'll do npm install. The reason I'm doing this is for whatever reason, Cursor is not auto-completing things for me. So just doing npm install and bringing the node modules locally should solve that problem. Of course, I'm still working through Docker Compose, but that's kind of what I wanted to do here. Okay, so inside of my app, I'm gonna have a login as my login page. So I wanna go ahead and do login like that. And what you'll see is there's also this catch-all route here that's like this. So I'm gonna go based off of still login, even though it says .sign in. I'm gonna go ahead and create another folder with those two brackets. And instead of it being sign in, we're gonna go ahead and do login. And then of course, the next thing is going to be basically the Clerk stuff to sign in. So let's see how this works. I'm gonna go ahead and bring it in here with page.jsx, bring in the sign in component. There we go. And I'll call this my login page, just like that. Okay. So all I want to test first is that I can actually go to login, for example. So if I go to this page now, I should be able to see this. This is great. So this is the same as what I saw before. And if I were to go log in, we can take a look at what happens here. Of course, I do log in and it takes me to the home page. And then if I were to log in again or attempt to, it redirects me. So it automatically does that for me. So it handles a lot of that stuff all around, which is great. So the next thing though is going to be the log out or register. We'll just go ahead and do register, for example. And then this one is going to be, we'll change it to ... register. And then of course, this is going to be our sign up element. And this is now our register page. Great. So again, if I go into sign up, I'm already logged in. It's not sign up, but rather register. It doesn't allow me to sign up. So I got to log out to be able to see those things. And there we go. Okay. So what we could do, instead of having it automatically redirect in here, I could actually use the user. So I can say const user equals to use user, right? And so basically, if there is not a user, then we can return back the sign up, right? So just something like that. Otherwise, we can go ahead and just say something like you are already signed up and logged in. Okay, let's try that out now. And we did not pass in, oh, it didn't bring it in. So let's go ahead and make sure we do. And let's go ahead and change this to use client. Let's see if that solves our issue there. And there we go. So we've got our register. I'm obviously not signed in. With register, you can absolutely still log in and that still works just fine. So you can use either page for that. So let's go back into register here and there we go. So now I have the ability to either show that register page again or sign up. The nice thing about this is then you could potentially share it or maybe have them log out or something along those lines. But that's actually pretty nice. So that's where we'll leave it at in terms of the login, log out portion. That said, what we want to also look at though is if I were to sign out and go into the dashboard, for example, I probably don't want to automatically go into this sign in thing. Maybe I want it to go into my login page. So to do that, we can go back into the docs and we can just take a look at some environment variables that we have. Now, notice that in the middleware, it does have the is public route. So this is kind of doing the reverse of what we were doing, which is basically saying, hey, if it's not a public route, then we're going to go ahead and require a login. We did, if it's one of these routes, then require a login. So I like specifying what routes I want to require a login for, not necessarily specifying what login routes I don't want. So I'm going to default to not having login required, and I'll make that decision when the component is created. But next, what we can do is we can update our environment variables based off of all of these login things. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll bring it into our Next.js local one. I'm also going to go ahead and take a look at the signup one. So if we look at the custom signup page, I also want to have that one in there as well. So I'll go ahead and copy that also. And there we go. So the defaults in here are sign in and sign up. So this means to me right away, I'm going to want to have a catch-all for those. So one of the quickest ways to do it is just to say sign in, and then again, doing a catch-all, sign in, and then doing page.jsx, and then basically just returning export default function of the page. And this is going to return, or not return anything, but rather just do redirect. And this is going to go back into, this is going to be login. Okay, so that will redirect us to that. This should be not any of those things. I'm not sure what that auto completion is. This is what I was referring to with the auto completion errors within Cursor. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy this same thing and do it again. This time it's going to be sign up. And I think the catch-all should still work with sign in, but I'll change it to sign up as well. And then we'll look at that page, and this should be register. Okay, so this gives me those defaults. So if I go into my project again and we go into sign up like that, it should bring me back to register. Great. So you could test the login one as well. But of course, the component that we want to change is the environment variable. So the default login is going to be login. The default sign up is going to be sign up, and the default sign in is going to be login. And so now when I go into dashboard, it's going to take me to that value, assuming that my environment variables are correct, or at least working. So what that means is I just need to go back into my project here. We'll navigate into the root, Docker compose down. We will go ahead and remove the orphans here. And then of course we will bring it right back up just to flush out those environment variables, make sure they're working correctly, and then we'll jump into dashboard here. And sure enough, there it goes. It logs in, or takes us to our own login page now. We can go ahead and continue on, and that brings us back to our dashboard. So technically speaking, it still works the same way, but it's just slightly different. And of course, that also would mean that our sign in and sign up buttons, we probably want to change as well. So the way we would do that, of course, is go into our component here, and we've got our signed in component. This probably should still work. And then our signed out component also probably should still work. So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and just create a link here. So we'll go ahead and do link, and this is going to be from Next.js link. And then we'll go ahead and do href, and this is going to be a login. So login, and then once again, our link here, and href and register. Okay, and there we go. Get rid of those two things. Now we've got these conditions in here for signed in and signed out. So let's go ahead and try this out. So I go to login, continue to log in. There we go. We're logged in, and then this component is still showing up. I think there's probably a way to customize this component if you'd like, but the point here is we've got register, login, sign up, all of the good things that you might want in some sort of login required, as you would expect. If you know Next.js, you might be aware of the configuration that will allow for redirects just to be really simple. So we're going to go ahead and implement that now. I would say most of the time this is probably the route you're going to want to go instead of what I showed you before. But the point of this was really just to make sure that you understand the two different ways of doing redirect. So if we come in to our project here and we navigate on down into Next.js config MJS, inside of this argument here is where we put in that redirects parameter, and then you would do your source. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and do sign in, which I'm not currently mapping, and I want the destination to be login, right? And we could do that same thing for something like sign up and then register, right? And this is going to be a permanent redirect itself. So there we go. We've got 2 redirects in here. So the important part about this configuration is going back into compose.yaml that our watch command, right? We're looking at our watch command in here. This may or may not need to rebuild it, but also our volumes in here, just like that. These things may or may not need to be rebuilt, but I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I'm running docker compose up Next.js app -- watch, just to make sure that that thing's all built out and those redirects are working correctly. So going back into my project now, if I go into sign up without the dash, hit enter, it should redirect me to the login page or the register page, depending on what I have. In the case of this one, I'm already signed in, so I don't need to do anything. Obviously, the login page should also redirect me home. So basically overriding those different ones that were in there, and then sign in as well. And there we go. So what we notice, of course, is if the login page, for example, if we were to be redirected here and we're already signed in, it redirects one more time. The same thing is true with the register page, but this has a condition where it might even just show us this page instead of redirecting us. So now I can just go ahead and get rid of these 2 sign in and sign up ones. We don't need them anymore, and we can just add them in as additional arguments in here. So just put in a dash, and there's probably a wildcard that you can add in for those things. When it comes to this kind of redirect, I like being very specific about what I'm attempting to redirect, not just have wildcards willy-nilly. But there we go. So that's just a little kind of improvement for the redirects themselves, just so you're aware that this, yes, this exists and it's much better. Layouts in Next.js are probably one of my favorite things. So if we actually take a look in the app here, let's say, for instance, I'm going to go ahead and do something called posts. So inside of here, we'll eventually have a page that actually has posts in here. For now, I'm going to go ahead and export a default function here, and we'll just call it posts page, and then we'll go ahead and return back just a hello world, right? So h1 hello world, there we go. Okay, so naturally, if I were to go into that page, I can see it. I can go into posts here, and there's my hello world. And of course, my dashboard's in here as well. So if I want to change the layout of a single page, what I can do is I can come into what that page is going to be, and I can change it. So let's go into dashboard here, and we'll do layout.jsx. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste some layout that already works, and that's going to be our dashboard layout here, and there it is. Okay, so I'm going to save that, and we'll go back into our project. Here's our dashboard now. The nice thing about this current layout is basically everything that's nested inside of here will also use that same layout. Very similar to the app itself. Everything that's nested inside of the app uses the app layout. So in this case, this is the dashboard layout. So if I go into /contact, it has that same layout. But of course, if I go into /posts, it does not. So the way we solve this is actually super cool. What we do here is inside of our app, we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this console. And using those parentheses is how we can actually group things together. So I'm going to go ahead and now drag dashboard into there. I'm also going to go ahead and drag posts into there, make sure it's going into console itself, so that inside of console we have dashboard and posts. And now into posts here, I should be able to refresh. Not quite yet, because dashboard itself, I also want to move the layout into that console as well. And then now the layout is inside or nested inside of the console. Posts and dashboard are also in there without their own layouts, just pages all aboard. Okay, so now if I look at posts, it's now showing me the posts. If I look at the dashboard, it's now showing me the dashboard. Great. So what I can do then is inside of this layout, I can come back and I can add in some links in here for these different elements. So like, for instance, our contact. Well, up until this point, we've had it in dashboard. I'm just going to move it out and put it into the console itself. This is now contact. And then I also have posts in here, which might actually be above contact, depending on how you want to do this. But the idea here is now I've got post, contact, and dashboard. There's my links. And so I can now navigate between these things in here. So contact, post, dashboard, and of course, everything's navigated in there. And it still has this nav bar on top. And of course, the reason for that has to do with this layout right here. There's that nav bar. So I could naturally remove that nav bar and change how I want to lay these things out later. But for now, I've got this whole console in here, which is super nice. But of course, there's one more thing about this. The reason I called it console was really to have everything in there, all like nested in there and everything. But what I really want to do is make sure that I don't accidentally have a route to console. I want that route to be redirected. So going back into our little redirects here, I'm going to go ahead and copy this, paste in here. Now I'm going to go ahead and do console and then do parentheses again, .star. So basically everything after console, I just wanted to go into the dashboard itself. So if someone were to go into console here and type in, it will automatically redirect to that dashboard, which also means that if I were to sign out of here and go into console with some gibberish next to it, it should also redirect it. So I might have to restart my project here. Let's go ahead and try that out. I might need to restart it just for the redirects to take hold. So let's go ahead and do our Docker Compose down here. And then we'll go ahead and do the Docker Compose up again, and I'll refresh in here. That should catch everything and redirect now, which is requiring me to log in. So the nice thing about having these redirects and also, something along the lines of a login required, if we look back into our middleware, the middleware is really just one single route that's handling everything. This is one of the reasons why I also like to declare login routes so that I can specify everything that does need to be logged in. So all of these other ones, we might want to log in, right? So we might want to say that, if you go to /contact, perhaps you want to actually force that login as well, in which case you would come in here and do that same thing. And I would just bring it in just like that. And then maybe also into your posts as well. Right? So all of those things are now login required, and it's really just that simple. So you really want to just think about it when you come through the whole process itself. Now, one of the other parts about the actual layout itself is we could modify this based off of the user. Now, you could do that same thing that we did with the register, so feel free to go through just like this, where it's the exact same process. You can modify the layout as well if you wanted to allow contact to be a specifically dashboard rendered one, or if you wanted to be a combination of logged in or logged out. It's completely up to you, but the point here is that we now have better layouts depending on the user and what they are able to access themselves in terms of, their just standard permissions in here. Let's create a Next.js form so we can actually allow our users to send data to our backend. So I'm going to go ahead and actually create a component in the components directory. We're going to call this our posts create form.jsx, and it's going to be export default function here of posts create form, and then it's going to be like that. We also want this to be a client rendering form, so I'll go ahead and use client here, and then we're going to go ahead and return the form itself. Now, before I go much further, forms themselves, how you can handle them are twofold. First off, you might declare a form ref, which is a React hook that you can bring in, and you can quite literally leave it in as null to start. And you can come in here and just say ref equals to the form ref. And so that means that when we go to select a button, so I'm going to go ahead and now do const handle submit, and this will take in some sort of event here, which we will just go ahead and do event.prevent and default. And then I'll go ahead and console log out. Well, actually, I want to grab that form ref data, which we'll go ahead and do that with basically saying const my form data being new, and this is form data, which takes in the form ref.current, the current reference that's being used. This is done when you initialize this. That whole thing can now work. Okay, so basically what I want to see here is I want to also see my form data object, which is object.fromEntries from that form data, so you can actually see a JavaScript object in here. So we're going to go ahead and console log that out. Okay, so where do we put this handle submit? There's actually a number of places where we could put it. We could put it directly on the form itself, so we could do on submit right here. We could also put it in a button where it's on click, and not on can play, but rather on click. We can also pass that same thing in there. Or we could use standard HTML and not do it here, but rather turn the button into a submit button, in which case it would also trigger that because of the form itself. Okay, so what I want to do then is from here, I would then declare a text area, right? And so this text area is the actual data we're going to send back. So we want to give it a name of some kind. In this case, I'll call it content. So the object itself then would have something like content and then some value here. So I probably want to make sure that this is required as well. But the idea is we want to make sure that there is some value coming back. And this content right here is the same name as that. So if I change this to that, then it would be like that. So those keys actually do make a big difference here. Next, we're going to go ahead and add in a placeholder here and say something like your content. And then I want to actually add in a few Tailwind CSS classes so it actually just looks a little bit better. And that's going to be a border, make it rounded, make it full width, and then do a little bit lighter of a border and then a little bit of padding there. Great. So that's going to be my form that we're going to take a look at. Let's go ahead and implement this into our post page here. And I'm just going to put this around a div, and then I'll go ahead and do my post create form in here. And then we will go ahead and do our hello world like that. Okay, so everything's being imported correctly. So now let's go ahead and do our Docker compose down, remove orphans. We're going to bring everything back up and Docker compose up and watch. So I have all of my apps going up now, not just Next.js, which is going to be important for the next part. Okay, so now if I were to go into my post page here, I can see my content and I can type out gibberish. And if I go into inspecting the element, I should be able to see that gibberish in there. And of course I can send it as many times as I want to. What I really want to do is remove that form. Once it's submitted, I want to reset the form itself. Before I do that though, this form ref current can be handled in another way. So you can actually grab the data. So the form input data is event.target or something along those lines. This is actually the form input, or maybe the form element would be a better way to call this. We bring that in just like that. It's the same exact data. This one, we use form ref mostly so that we can come down here and do form ref.current.reset. And that's it. That's the main reason we use the form ref in here versus just using the standard form element, which is something you would do in like vanilla JS. But in React and Next.js, you can use ref so that you can put in gibberish, send it, and then it just resets the form. To me, this is by far the easiest way to manage forms. If you've never done it before, this is like just only a few lines, and then we just need to figure out what to do with our content itself. To do that, we need to bring in a hook from Clerk, and you might be familiar with what hook we're going to use, and that is, of course, going to be our use auth hook in here. So notice that it's coming from Clerk React, which may or may not work correctly. I think it would actually work just fine. But if you actually look in the documentation, we've got a use auth for Next.js. You go into the example. Here is that same exact thing. I believe it works exactly the same, but it's optimized for Next.js. So we basically want to use that version. And we've got a lot of different ideas in here in terms of the use auth hook itself. So of course you can go through that process. We just want the token. We don't need the user ID. We don't need, maybe is loaded would be a good idea. But overall we've got is, get token in here, which means that down here we would do const token equals to get token. But in this case, we actually need to make it an asynchronous function. So we just are going to go ahead and change it to being an asynchronous function in here as well. So we just put async right there, in which case we can do await. And so now we should be able to do our token. Let's go ahead and grab that token. We'll console log both things out and just see if that ends up working for us. So we'll refresh on our post page here. I'll hit send. There's my token. There's my content. Great. So far, so good. Now, of course, this is a token that's specific to the user themselves, but the idea here is now we are going to bring in our headers, and those headers are going to be our authorization headers. And that's going to be a string substitution here. So we'll go ahead and do bearer, and it's going to be that token. This, of course, is necessary to send this data back. Okay. So the data we're going to send back is actually going to be JSON data. So I'll go ahead and say my form data JSON, or maybe as JSON, equals to JSON.stringify of this object data right here. which also means that we might want to come into our headers and do something like content type and then pass in application JSON. This is very typical for posting data to a backend of some kind. So now I'm going to go ahead and do like maybe, for instance, my API backend, and we had that, I think, at http:// not HTTPS, but localhost, and I believe we said 8,000. Let's just verify inside of compose.yaml. We've got our Django app here. It's actually 8888. So that's the one we're going to work off of. Although we could test both of them. We could test Django, and I'll just call this my Django API backend. And we might as well go ahead and grab the FastAPI backend as well, the FastAPI API backend, which is kind of funny, but that's going to be 8002. Great. So now that we've got that, we would say something along the lines of response equals to await fetch the endpoint we're going to go ahead and use. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and pass in our options, which is going to be a few things. So the options that we want to say, I'll go ahead and say my HTTP options equals to, well, first off, we would declare the method, which is going to be post. We would declare the headers, which are these headers, of course. And then we would declare the body of it, which is going to be the JSON data, the stringified JSON data. And then we send that in as our response. And then basically we would want to come in here and say if the response.ok, then we will go ahead and reset the form. I'll go ahead and say alert, something along the lines of working, thanks. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and console log. Let's go ahead and grab the text that comes back. So that's going to be our, let's say our text equals to await response.text. And then we'll go ahead and console log out what that our text is going to be. Now, of course, this shouldn't work. It shouldn't work yet, but at the very least, the actual HTTP request is in there. So I'm going to go ahead and log this out, hit send, and I get an error on our page, page not found in here. So we don't actually have anything related to the API already set up. So we're going to, of course, need to update that and make sure that that's working in the very near future. It's probably going to be something like, API/posts, and that would probably be true in FastAPI as well. And we'll take a look at doing both of those things. But at this point, we should have a create form. Now, I mostly did this for those of you who have never done something like this before. So I realize that some parts might be a little bit fast, but overall, the JavaScript that we wrote here can be used in vanilla JavaScript. All of this stuff in here with the exception of the token itself, but handling a submit handler, there's a standard sort of callback that you would end up using. And so that's why I ended up doing it this way. There are convenience things that you can use out there to do post methods for JavaScript and for Next.js, but I think this is very straightforward and it works really well. It's like one of the most consistent things that will work across pretty much all platforms, and including using the browser-based fetch API. Now that we've got this post create form, let's actually use the FastAPI backend as a first proof of concept that this thing is working. So the key part of this is there's a method at post, and then we've got an endpoint on our application at API/posts. So what we want to do then is jump into our FastAPI application, open up main.py, and we want to create a URL route for that method. So the first part is saying it's a post method, so HTTP post, and where do we want it to go, which was API/posts, just like that, with the trailing slash and everything. So that's going to be our post method. That's where the data is going to now come in. We want to change the name of the function. This one is going to be just something like create post. And so now that we've got this, how do we actually unpack the data that's coming in? The way you do that in FastAPI is by creating a Pydantic schema. So we are going to go ahead and do from Pydantic. We're going to import the base model here. You can think of this as a schema itself, but it's called base model. So we're going to stick with base model. And then right above the post method here, I'm going to go ahead and say class, and we're going to do our post create schema. Perhaps we'll call it that just to make it nice and easy on us. And now we just need to know what content's coming through. In our case, it's going to be content with a data type of string. With FastAPI, that's all you have to write out. That's it. And so this content right here corresponds directly to the name of this content right here, the actual form that's coming back. So normally what you would do is you would build out the API before the front end, but we want to actually do it a little bit reverse just so we can see what's going on and seeing different backends as well. So now that we've got this post create data here, we're going to go ahead and grab a payload value. This, of course, is going to be that post create schema here. This name of payload is fairly arbitrary, but it goes back to what we've saw before with Clerk itself also uses payload. This is a very common way to declare data that's coming in inside of FastAPI. So this is incoming data, so I can actually print out what this data is, which of course is payload.model dump. That's one way on how we can look at it. We could also just go ahead and do payload and then dot content, like the dot notation for the class itself and this attribute of that class. So both of those things should work. And I'm just going to go ahead and repeat back the actual content itself in the terms of just grabbing this and saying content and then payload.content. And let's actually write it out correctly. Great. So now that we've got that saved, let's go ahead and try this out in our front end. I'll refresh in Next.js and just say hello world again, hit save, and working, thanks. Great. So that actually means it sent the data. If we look inside of our terminal for FastAPI, let's take a look at what that does. There's our dumped data. That's the model dump. And then the content is right after. That's working as well. Now, it's just a matter of then spinning up a database to connect this data, which is also fairly straightforward. And it's a lot similar to Pydantic, but it's using something like SQL model, which I covered a lot in other places. But the point here is how quickly we can get this data up and going on the FastAPI side. Let's take a look at how we do it with the Django side. Let's create some API views in Django to handle that post data for our user. So what we're going to do is very similar to what we did before with our Hello World API. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this module. I'm going to bring it on over into post.py. And this time what we're going to do is something like create post API view and basically say if not request.method equals to post, then we'll just go ahead and return a JSON response of like 400. We'll go ahead and say detail and not allowed and status being 400. Okay. So now we've got this API view, and of course we've got that login required still, so we should be able to get the requested user. I'm gonna go ahead and print out what that user is in just a moment. But then of course the data that would be coming through in here is, well, it's gonna be from our body data. So I'm gonna go ahead and print out request.body, and we'll take a look at what that is as well. So now that I've got a view function, I'm gonna go ahead and bring it into my urls.py. Normally I would actually separate out the URLs, but I wanna keep things as straightforward as possible. So I'm just gonna go ahead and import the function right in directly. So we'll go ahead and do posts.api. We're gonna go ahead and import the create post API view. And so I'll go ahead and bring it in here, and this one is just going to be simply posts. Okay, so we've got our post create API view in here now. And what I want to do then, of course, is go back into my form here. And all I need to do is change out which backend I'm going to be using here. So we'll go ahead and save that. And let's see what happens. So if I do a quick refresh on my post here and type out some gibberish and hit run, I get an error. Now, when it comes to Django itself, there is something called CSRF. I believe we talked about it before, but when it comes to building out an API in Django directly, you need to make sure that you are allowing the correct data to come through in the correct places. So that means we need to make this CSRF exempt. So from Django.views.decorators.csrf, we're going to go ahead and import the CSRF exempt decorator. And then I'm going to go ahead and add this into the very top here and just see if that changes anything for us. So what we should be able to see inside of Docker is that it does refresh and all that. So let's go ahead and give it another try in the front end, do some gibberish in there, and now I get auth required. That doesn't make sense. Why is it unauthorized? That doesn't make sense at all, in the sense that we've got our front end logged in, and if we verify in our front end, we will see all of our headers are in there, all the token. We could console log all that stuff out. So this user should definitely be authorized. In fact, the problem is something that you would have faced with FastAPI as well. Had we have actually printed out this Clerk user ID, we would have seen the same issue, and it has everything to do with the authorized parties API endpoint. This is all optimized for the React one, the Vite one, the one we were doing before. So in both places, we need to change that. Now, inside of Django, I'm going to go ahead and do it here. This is going to be my Clerk frontend. So I'll go ahead and say something along the lines of, let's say, Clerk frontend, itself, or let's say Clerk frontend host, os.environ.get, and then we'll grab whatever that value is going to be. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this same thing into our FastAPI application as well. We might as well put it in both places. And this is what I'm going to use for my authorized parties. And if you wanted to have more than one, I think one of the easy ways to do it would just be 1 and 2, and then basically allowing authorized parties to be a list. And so I would basically say something along the lines of if that, then we would go ahead and append this. And we can do that same thing with Django as well. So I'll go ahead and copy all of these and go into Django here, paste it in. The Django one is going to be our Clerk auth parties like that. So it's just a little bit closer to what you would normally do with Django itself. And there we go. Okay, so there's our Clerk config now. And with these auth parties here, we should be able to update our Clerk call, which I believe was in our Decorator. We've got a wrap view in here for the login required, which is not quite it. And our utils here, there it is. So there's our authorized parties. So once again, the settings.authorized parties here, and then we'll use that. That would allow for both the React and the Next.js application to work, assuming we have those environment variables, which we do not yet. So let's go ahead and jump into our env backend local, and let's go ahead and add in those two arguments that we had prior. So the first one is going to be http://localhost 3000, and then the second one I think is 3002. Of course, we can look up the ports themselves into compose.yaml. So our Next.js app ports, there we go, 3000, React app 3002. Great, so now we should be able to get that data. It should actually work now for both places, and it was way more apparent because we wanted to actually have this login required decorator, something we just didn't build out in FastAPI. But now that we've got that, let's go ahead and actually see what the print statement does. Let's refresh in here, run this, and now it's saying auth required still, which is interesting. So maybe we need to reboot everything. I think it's actually that. So we'll go ahead and do Docker compose down and remove orphans. Of course, the environment variables changed, so we should probably reboot our Docker compose for that reason. And so now hopefully it will actually work. So let's try that again with hello world, ! Hit send. Great, that part's working. But of course we didn't actually store anything in Django. So if I go ahead and save again in Django, I see that I get this byte string in here. What if I actually did print out request.post and see what that looks like as well? So I can go ahead and do this and run that again, working again, and save it again, and we get nothing in there. So when it comes to API views like this, often you'll see the post data. Sometimes you'll even see request.data. This is something else that you might actually run into depending on the API you end up using. But let me go ahead and send data again. This time it doesn't even give me that one. So we're going to be using the body data itself. So what we want to do is decode this, and it's going to be UTF-8, I believe. So let's go ahead and try that out. We'll save that one, refresh, run it again, and save it again. And there's the content data. This is a string, so I'm going to go ahead and come in here and do import JSON, and then our actual data is going to be JSON.loads of this data in here. And then now I'm going to go ahead and be able to see the actual data itself, in which case I'll go ahead and run it again, and hopefully we don't get any errors here. There it is, working, thanks. We can save it, and we should see the data. Sure enough, there it is. Now we can do the magic of adding it into a database by grabbing the blog post model itself. So we'll go ahead and do that. So from.models, we're going to import the blog post model. And all I'm going to do here is say something along the lines of blog post.objects.create, the user being equal to the user. And then we're just going to go ahead and unpack the data itself, which basically turns all of those keyword arguments into something like this. which hopefully is very clear. If it's not clear, just go ahead and do content equals to data.get content. That's perfectly okay as well. And so now that will give us an object that comes back. So we'll go ahead and say our blog, let's do our blog post obj is that. And so our JSON response might be the object ID and then the content itself, which of course is going to be something along those lines. This will be coming from the database itself. We no longer need to print out anything, and that login required should just work at this point. So in our front end, I actually want to see what that data looks like. So let's go ahead and add it into our console log. So into our Next.js application, we'll go into that component itself. And then inside of request response OK, instead of alert working, I'm going to go ahead and grab the actual data, or we'll call it our response data. And this is going to be await, and this is going to be response.json. It should be JSON data coming back. We will verify that in a moment. Then I'm going to come up in here and say, data and set data. We'll do use state being an empty string. We'll go ahead and set this data from the response itself. So we'll do that, something along those lines. There we go. And then down in the form itself, I'll just go ahead and say, data and in JSON.stringify of that data. There we go. So we should be able to see it now. So let's give it a shot and say hello world, hit send, and we get an error. Bummer. Okay, so let's go ahead and see why. What we've got is no table named all of that. Okay, so we've got a little bit of an issue with our Django project. Really simple one though. So we'll go ahead and do docker compose run. This is going to be, I think, our Django app bin/bash, Python manage.py, make migrations, and I'll go ahead and do a one-off value, and we'll say 1, and then Python manage.py migrate. I can explain all that stuff some other time. The point here is I put a default value for pre-existing database entries, which I just set to 1 as the default user. Now that those migrations are done, let's go ahead and try it again with a hello world, hit send. There's our data, one single post. I'll go ahead and say another cool 1A. And then hit send, and there's our post. Fantastic. Obviously, we want to see that data soon, but the idea then is back into our API here, I could serialize this data even more, as in giving a serialized response of some kind. So let's go ahead and do user ID. This is going to be request.user. I think we called it the clerk user ID. Let's just verify in our custom model, and into accounts, models, clerk user ID, sure enough, there it is. And we'll go back into our API. Okay, so that's one way on how we could do it. And we could also do it directly from the content itself, which is going to be that blog user clerk ID. Those are the same exact thing, especially because we set those things as the same as well. But overall, we'll go ahead and call this user ID 2. And we'll try that once again, and we'll do some new content, exclamation mark, hit send. There's my user IDs. Fantastic. So we now have it well integrated into just purely Django. All of this could absolutely be done without Django, or just Django, I should say. You could use Django REST Framework, Django Ninja, or any other kind of Django API service that's out there. But if you see how simple this is, I think it's actually fairly straightforward to just do it yourself, especially when you have something as powerful as that login function with Clerk. We're going to take a look at the Python shell in Django so that we can better understand QuerySets before we implement it in the API. So if we see here, the actual creating or storing of the data is very simple. We grab the model itself, we do the .objects because this is the way the Django project works, and then we do .create, and then all of the fields we want to store. Of course, our models have those fields in there as well. Created at is one that just automatically gets generated. But let's take a look at that right now, because what we want to do is we now want to have an API endpoint that grabs specific user data. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to jump into Docker compose run, and then of course it's going to be our Django app, and then we'll go ahead and do bin/bash. And then in here, we should be able to run Python manage.py shell. And now we have access to the Django managed shell, which means that we can actually do blog post.objects objects.all and hit enter. Now, if you're not aware of this, in Django 5.2, your models automatically get imported. It's a really nice improvement, so you don't actually have to import them. When in older versions of Django, you would have to go from posts.models, and then you'd have to import like the blog post itself and make sure that you then call the query set itself. Okay, so this is a very standard query set. This is getting every item in the Django database. It does it really efficiently though. It's not like it's going to grab millions of rows if they're in there. It would if we did something like for O in this actual query set here, like a for loop, and then we print out like o.content or something and hit enter twice. That will then hit the database. This first one doesn't necessarily hit it in the same way. This one would hit every single item in that database. Okay, so the point of this is to really narrow down our users though. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go ahead and in here do from django.contrib.auth. We're going to import the get user model function, and we're going to go ahead and grab that get user model, and then we're going to go ahead and do user.objects.all, and that should give us all of our users. In our case, it's just one single user, and it's that custom user. Granted, if you had a lot more users, it'd be very similar to this blog post in here. So all I'm going to do is say my user equals to the user.objects.all and then .first, as in the very first item that comes up, and then I can do something like my user. This user right here is the request user that we'll have in our view. That's kind of the reason I'm doing that, why I'm importing them all together. So now that we've got this user in here, what I want to do then is I want to narrow down the objects themselves based off of this user. So I'm going to go ahead and do blogpost.objects.filter, and then the field for our user is going to be this field right here. It's quite literally a foreign key to the exact same model, to the exact same custom user. So I can actually do user equals to my user and hit enter. It just so happens that these are the exact same blog posts because we only have one user and we only entered a few blog posts. But this is actually how we can filter down that data. And again, you see that it's called QuerySet. So a lot of times what you end up seeing is QS equals to all of that data. So you would do something like that. And then from here, we can narrow it down even further, and we can get our data and say something like qs.values, and we can specify the values we want. So we can say user, content, and hit enter, and then take a look at the data. There's our data. So this is the actual stored Django user database user. So if I actually were to come in user and do clerk user ID with those two underscores here, the reason that is this part right here is even available is because that, of course, is in our custom user model right there. So basically, I'm doing a related lookup. This is another reason to have foreign keys, is because then you can do these related lookups, and I should be able to grab that data. So if I hit enter here and do data, I can now see there's my clerk user ID, and there it is right there. And then I've got my content and all of that. It's fantastic. It's a very easy way to make sure that that stuff is working correctly. So there are more advanced things that we could do within a query set of some kind. I don't recommend doing too much advanced stuff yet until you still really, understand how query sets work. But the main idea here is we want to list out, eventually we will list out this data. This will be part of our API response. So we just needed to understand these different query sets in here before we actually changed our API view and make sure that that is all working as well. Let's take a look. Let's turn our create post API view into a list or create post. So the way this is going to work is based off of the request method. We will handle it slightly differently. So what I want to do is I'm going to grab this if post method in here and just say if it is post, then I'll go ahead and tab all of this stuff in. I'm going to move the user right above that. And then basically what I want to do is inside of the first call, I'll now go ahead and say if request method not in a list of potential objects here, or potential post or HTTP methods here. And so I'll do something like that. Now there are methods that are like require post or require get that Django can use, but they don't all return a JSON response, which is why I'm doing this right here. So after this is done, then we can also go ahead and assume the get method, in which case I can now go ahead and grab a query set like we saw before, which would be blogpost.objects.filter, and this is going to be user equaling to user. And then we can also do something like order by, and we can put reverse created at. So the newest ones will show up first. If we just leave it as the default, it will be created at, which would mean the oldest ones are first. I want it to be in reverse order because I'm sort of making a feed here, if you will. From that, we would then say our data equals to qs.values, and we would come in here and turn it into different values. So the values we want to use, once again, we talked about this in the last part, it's going to be something like content and maybe created at, right? So those might be the only values you actually want to show or send back. Now, there is one other value that you might want to have, which of course is going to be the specific blog post ID. So if you want to have some sort of detail view for that blog post, you would be able to do that. A detail view as in its own unique link or something along those lines, which I'm not going to cover at this point. But the idea here is we now have these values. You also might want to use the user data. So you would do something like user 2 underscores here, the clerk user ID. Perhaps that's something you want to do, which of course is going to be the clerk custom user model. And we're grabbing that field right here. This is why we actually have our user model customized in the first place, is so that we can get associated data to that user. We could do it this way. There's another way to do it, which you could do user.blogpostset.all or .filter, all of these same sort of things. You could do both of those. Those actually do work. For me, I like writing out the actual query set and all of the queries right up front. So I typically do it this way in terms of queries themselves. But now that we've got this data here, our actual response data still needs to be a dictionary. So I'm going to go ahead and give our response data, and that's going to be something like our results equals to the data itself. And we want it to be a list of data because it's not a query set. It needs to be able to be JSON serializable, which means JSON.dumps. I need to be able to pass that in just like that. If that doesn't work, which you could use the shell for if you want to test it out, or you could write automated tests as well. But the idea here is if this doesn't work, then of course it won't actually do the JSON response. But I'm going to go ahead and now do something like return the JSON response of that response data. Now, do keep in mind that we could also do something like the count here and do qs.count and actually get a sense as to how much data is actually coming back. You might want to paginate data, which means like chunking it into different pages so that you're not getting all of the data that matches this filter. You might not want to do that. You also might want to filter down by time and all of that. Those are things that are a little bit more advanced than what we need to do here. I just really want this part working so that we can now bring it into the front end. This stuff's not all that complicated. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and now take a look at the front end to see how this is shaking out. So we need to actually do the API requests in the front end as well. Before we do that though, we want to update the name of the view, which is going to be list or create the post API view now. And I want to bring this into my URLs and update that as well, just so that we have both of those things in there as the API endpoint itself. I want it to show that so then I can just look at this view and be like, oh, okay, it does both of those things. That is why I'm being that explicit about that. More than likely, I would actually do something more like post list create or API view, more like that. So I have the actual item that I'm using first and then the methods or the things that it supports thereafter. But I'm going to keep it just like this, just for, again, proof of concept. We're now going to list the user data into our Next.js app right underneath this form here. So the way we're going to do that is by using a package called SWR. So let's go ahead and jump into our terminal here. I'm going to go ahead and do docker compose run, and it's going to be our Next.js app bin/bash. We'll go ahead and do npm i SWR or npm install SWR. And then we'll go ahead and use SWR in here. So inside of my SRC here, I'm going to go ahead and create hooks. And we're going to go ahead and create a new one called use clerk swr.js. And in here, we're going to go ahead and export a default function called use clerk swr, which will take in an argument of URL. So if we actually look at the SWR docs in here, what we can see is we just did the npm install part. We've got a fetcher part in here that we can bring in. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. This will be pasted in here. We will change this a little bit in just a moment. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add in actually use it in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we want to actually return back that value, which is going to be our URL that we pass in here. This is nice because then I don't have to redeclare the fetcher everywhere is kind of the point there. But it's also nice because then what I can do is I can actually change this a little bit by saying async in here. And then that way I can actually pass in a few other arguments that we might want. So I'm going to go ahead and put this into a dictionary here. There we go. So I'm going to return that back. But what I want here is I want to bring in some headers in here. And what are those headers going to be? Well, we've already seen this. So going into our component form here, we've got our headers right there. And so we need it to be asynchronous for this reason. I'm going to go ahead and copy a few things related to this, and we'll bring it in here, paste it in. We've got our headers now. I don't need any of this data in here. I just need that token. And then in my options, I'll go ahead and add that in as well, which is just going to be coming in here, using those args still, and then just bringing in headers and headers. Okay, I may or may not need application JSON in there, but I will leave it in just to make sure that's working. So of course I need to also import that get, the actual get token command here, which is the use auth and all that. So let's go ahead and do that also. And since we are doing this, let's go ahead and also put it into use client, which I think will be the case either way. And so we'll bring that in as well. And there we go. Okay, so now that we've got this, we're going to go ahead and give it a shot. This is now, of course, reusable in the front end. So this should allow us to do lookups anywhere. So we can just fetch data instead of needing to call one-off fetching like we were before. But then we also get all the benefits that the SWR package gives as well. So in our posts here, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go ahead and say const data is loading and error. And this is going to be use the Clerk SWR hook that we just created. We of course need an endpoint of some kind. That endpoint is going to be the same as we've seen before, that Django API backend. I'll go ahead and bring this into our page here. We're going to go ahead and paste that in, and I'll go ahead and do that. So first and foremost, I'll just go ahead and console log out the data is loading and the error. We'll save that, and let's go ahead and take a look with our Docker compose up. So Docker compose up and then -- watch. Make sure everything's up there. And I think with package.json being loaded, it should also have recreated that, Next.js app itself. One of the things with page I just realized is use SWR also needs to be in the client. So we need to make sure that our page is using the client as well. So there we go. So let's go ahead and save that, and we'll go ahead and take a look at our project here. It's going to refresh. Of course, it should actually give us, we didn't define a key characteristic of our hook. So let's go ahead and import that now. So import the use, I think it's use SWR, and it's from SWR. I think that's the import. Let's go ahead and double check inside of SWR itself, and it's just slightly different. Okay, there we go. So now we've got that import in there. Let's go ahead and take a look at our page now. At this point, what we see in here are our results, our count, whether or not it's loading, and if there's any errors. So there's our results. Pretty neat. So going back into our page then, I can go underneath this and basically say something along the lines of if it's loading, we'll say if, is loading. Then we'll go ahead and return back something in there. So I'm going to go ahead and return back like, loading. Let's do H1, just loading, right? And then basically if error, then we'll go ahead and do return div error happened, right? And then finally, we can now say results equals to data. If that's there, we'll do data.results. Otherwise, we'll just do an empty list here. And then of course we could count things out as well. And so then I'll go ahead and do results.map. And that's going to be in here. We would do a callback function to map everything out, which the data and the index value is going to come in here. So we'll do data IDX. And then I just want to return back a div, which will take in our data. So we can do something like data.content. And then with that iteration, we need to bring in the ID itself. So we'll go ahead and do the key and then $-IDX. There we go. And so that should loop through those things if we did everything correctly. And so we'll save that. And then I'll also add in a class name here. And we'll just go ahead and do border. And we'll do PX3, PY4. Maybe we'll do PY4 and PX2. And then rounded. Let's go ahead and save that. And there we go. So we've got some data coming in here. Great. I can also put a div around it and do class name. And we'll do space Y4. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at that. And there's our content in here now. Great. So that is, of course, showing up. Granted, our content itself, there's a lot more data in there altogether. Now, there's one more thing that I want to add in, and that is going to be mutate. So whenever you need to make changes to the data that's being rendered, you can pass this in to a child element. In this case, we want to pass it into the form itself so that then I can come into the form. And this is now a property of this, so I can do something like that. And basically down in our response OK, we would basically say if mutate, then we'll just call mutate. So that then I can go ahead and say, hello, world, my old friend. We can send that data then, and it refreshes the page down here, refreshes all of that data. That is what use SWR is really good for, as well as many other things. But that now is showing us that we can create data and we can also see this data. Now, we could always expand upon this to build out everything we would need for a full-on CRUD application or a create, retrieve, update, delete application for a user. And all we would really need to do is expand on our API endpoints, what we can support, and maybe learn what other things you might want to do within Django. But overall, it is, I think, pretty amazing because now I can sign out and I can try to go into that dashboard again. Of course, it's going to require me to sign in which case I can. I can go ahead and go back into the dashboard, go into my posts. There's my data. My data is so cool. And of course, we could also test this out with other users as well. So for example, if I were to open up another window, let me just grab this real quick here into like this email here. Hopefully I don't have to actually put in my password. We'll see. But we'll go ahead and log in with some other email that I've got. And here we go. Looks like we're going to be okay. Here's new data for this user. I can go ahead and send that in. There it is. Obviously, they aren't the same user and they're not having the same results in there whatsoever. Super cool, of course. And then back into Clerk, we can see these two users in here. It's fantastic. I really, really, really like how things are going with all of this. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. Now, if it wasn't clear, I am very excited about using Clerk in my projects, right? I think managing users is something that can be rather tedious, although it's unbelievably necessary. I think using Clerk removes a lot of that tediousness to make sure that you can just add in new features to your authentication at any time. One of those things that we didn't even look at is two-factor authentication. You can just click a few things and boom, it's going to be ready in Clerk, which I think is super cool. Granted, there's a lot more customizations and a lot more things that we can still cover, and at some point I want to, but the idea here is we have unlocked a new world of possibility just by decoupling how we manage our users. It's super cool, and I definitely am going to be using it in more projects. So thanks again to Clerk for sponsoring this one, and thank you for watching. I'm really excited about what's to come, so stay tuned and make sure you subscribe. Once again, my name is Justin Mitchell. Thank you very much.